If you are lying down right now, letting the day finally loosen its grip on you, let your shoulders drop a little further. Wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day brought you here, you have arrived somewhere quiet, somewhere with nowhere else to be for the next few hours. Tonight we go back to a time before roads, before bridges, before anyone had a word for the far side of anything. We go back to a time when a river was not a place you crossed on the way to somewhere else. It was a place that decided quietly and without appeal whether you lived at all. For most of human history, the water at the edge of camp was not scenery. It was the difference between the herd you could follow and the one you could never reach, between the family camped on this bank and the family camped on that one, between a hunting ground rich with game and a stretch of dry, exhausted land with nothing left to eat. A river could separate a person from food, from kin, from the next generation of their own bloodline, simply by being wide enough, cold enough, or fast enough to refuse them passage. People did not decide to cross rivers back then, not the way we might decide to cross a street. Rivers decided who got to keep living on which side of them, and the decision was rarely gentle. Picture a woman standing at a riverbank in what is now East Africa, close to 100,000 years ago. The dry season has broken late this year, and the water below her is higher and faster than she has ever seen it in her lifetime. Her daughter, perhaps 6 years old, stands close against her leg, watching the current pull branches and clumps of torn grass past them, moving so quickly that neither of them can follow a single piece of debris for more than a second or two before it vanishes downstream. Behind them, the land they have walked from has gone quiet in the particular way land goes quiet once the water sources have failed and the animals have already moved on ahead of the people. Ahead of them, across a channel that is perhaps 40 strides wide, the ground looks green in a way nothing behind them does. It looks like the kind of place that still has food in it. The woman has crossed narrower water before at gentler times of year, holding tightly to her daughter's hand and picking a slow, careful line across submerged stones she already knew. This crossing is different, and she can hear the difference before she can properly see it, that low, continuous roar of moving water that never seems to slow down or pause for anyone standing at its edge. She has to decide in the next few minutes whether the green land on the far side is worth the water in between. There is no bridge to consider, there is no boat waiting nearby, no rope, no raft left over from someone who crossed here before her. There is only her own body, her daughter's small hand inside hers, and a decision that history has left her almost entirely alone to make the way it left millions of people just like her. That single decision, repeated in some form by countless people across tens of thousands of years and thousands of different rivers, shaped far more of the human story than most of us were ever taught to notice. Long before anyone built the first true boat, our distant relatives were already finding themselves on the wrong side of water. They could not explain, stranded on islands separated from any mainland by channels far too wide and far too deep to have been simply walked across at low tide. Scholars still debate how some of the earliest human relatives managed to reach places like Flores Island in what is now Indonesia, at a time when almost nobody believed early hominins were capable of any kind of controlled water crossing at all. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is strange enough to keep researchers arguing for decades. Some of it may have been pure accident, storms and sudden flooding that swept unlucky travellers out onto floating trees and simply carried them somewhere entirely new whether they wanted to go or not. Some of it, a growing number of researchers now suspect, may have been something closer to intention. However crude and desperate that intention looked in practice, a raft lashed together out of pure necessity rather than any grand plan. Either way, the water that should have stopped them clearly did not stop everyone. It did stop enough people, though. It drowned enough families and turned back enough desperate, exhausted crossings that for most of our species' long walk across the earth, A river remained one of the most reliable, unremarkable ways for a human life to simply end quietly without ceremony, and often without anyone left behind to remember exactly how it happened. What survives in the record suggests this was not a rare or isolated danger, but a constant and familiar one woven into the ordinary rhythm of life, the way weather is woven into ours. Ancient footprints preserved in old riverbank mud hardened over tens of thousands of years, sometimes stop abruptly at the water's edge and never resume on the far side, a small silent detail that researchers still turn over carefully, unwilling to guess too confidently at what it meant for the person who left them. Other trackways show the opposite, a hesitant doubling back pattern along the bank, footprints layered over footprints as though someone paced the same stretch of shoreline several times before finally deciding one way or the other what to do. These are not dramatic discoveries. There is no drawing, no message, nothing written down. But to anyone who studies them closely, they read almost like a held breath, frozen in the mud for longer than most human civilizations have existed. Before we go any further into that story, into the crossings that succeeded and the many more that quietly did not, I want to ask something small of you, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for. If understanding what our ancestors actually faced not the tidy version we sometimes get handed, but the real and difficult one is something that keeps bringing you back to stories like this. Take a moment now to follow along and leave a like before you drift any further in. It genuinely helps this kind of long, patient storytelling find the people who are looking for exactly this. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what first drew you to a story like this one. I read every comment, even the short ones, even the ones written half asleep. For now, let yourself settle in properly, get comfortable, and let's begin. Because to understand what a river truly meant to a human being 60 or 80 or 100,000 years ago, you first have to understand the strange broken shape of the world those rivers were cutting through. It was not one continuous walkable landscape the way a map might suggest to us now with borders you could simply step over. It was a patchwork of separate small worlds stitched loosely together wherever the ground happened to stay dry and constantly unstitched by water that rose, fell flooded and shifted its course without warning or apology. On one bank of a river, an entire ecosystem could exist almost untouched by whatever lived on the other side. Elephants grazing on one bank might never once encounter the predators hunting only a few hundred strides away across the water. Antelope herds could develop slightly different habits, slightly different wariness, simply because they'd grown up watching a different set of dangers. Even the fish moving through the water itself sometimes diverged into distinct populations upstream and downstream of a single set of rapid, shaped by a barrier none of them had chosen and none of them could see the reason for. Early humans moved through this broken landscape the way anyone moves through unfamiliar territory with real consequences, attached cautiously and always listening for the sound of water before they ever saw it glinting through the trees. That sound, the low constant rush of a river running at full strength, became one of the oldest warnings the human ear ever learned to recognize, older by far than any warning about fire or any warning about a stalking predator in the grass. It meant opportunity waiting on the far side, food safety, sometimes family. It also meant the very real possibility that they might never reach any of it, and that the muddy ordinary ground they were standing on right now might be the last solid ground some of them would ever know. Even the animals seemed to understand something about this that took people far longer to learn. Herds would gather at certain crossing points for days at a time waiting, testing the current with a few brave individuals before committing the whole group, an instinct built over countless generations of loss. Humans watching from a cautious distance absorbed some of that same patience slowly, imperfectly, one drowned relative and one successful crossing at a time. It is into that world, one shaped as much by water as by hunger, as much by what a river refused to give as by what the land freely offered, that our story now moves. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a riverbank at dusk when the birds have finished their last calls and the water itself seems to be the only thing still awake. It is easy, standing at a place like that today, to think of a river as a single thing, one continuous ribbon of water with two banks that essentially belong to the same world. For most of the deep past, that was almost never true. A river was less like a ribbon and more like a wall with a current running through it, and the two sides of that wall could grow into places that barely resembled each other at all. Consider the Congo one of the great rivers of Africa, wide and powerful enough in places that it still cannot be bridged today across most of its length. For hundreds of thousands of years that river has done something remarkable to the animals living along it. Something so consistent and so strange that primatologists still find it almost hard to believe when they first encounter the evidence. On the northern bank of the Congo River live the common chimpanzee, an animal capable of real aggression, occasional warfare between neighbouring groups, and a social structure built partly around dominant competitive males. On the southern bank of that same river, separated by nothing more than water, lives an entirely different ape, the bonobo, an animal with a strikingly different temperament, one built far more around cooperation, female alliance, and a social calm that researchers still find genuinely surprising when they compare it to its closest relative just across the water. These two species share a very recent common ancestor. What appears to have pulled them apart over what is likely more than 1 million years is not distance in the way we usually think about it. It is one river wide enough and old enough that neither species has ever been able to simply walk across and rejoin the other. That is not a small detail. That is one of the clearest examples in the entire animal kingdom of a single river reshaping the personality, the social structure, and eventually the very biology of two closely related populations simply by being there. And if a river could do that to an ape as intelligent and adaptable as our closest living relatives, it becomes far easier to imagine what it was doing quietly and continuously to the early populations of our own species and the other human relatives who once shared the African continent alongside them. Scholars still debate exactly how many separate river-divided populations of early humans and near-humans existed across Africa and Asia at any given point in the deep past. The honest answer is that we will probably never know the full number, because most of those populations left behind nothing but scattered bone fragments, and because water itself, ironically, tends to destroy the very evidence that would tell us how it once kept people apart. The fossil record does suggest. Again and again is a pattern of small, somewhat isolated groups, each adapting slightly differently to slightly different conditions, separated not by mountains or deserts in most cases, but by water that never quite let them meet. Picture the landscape from a height the way a bird moving along a river's course might have seen it seasonally for tens of thousands of years running. On one side, herds of a particular antelope species graze in slightly different patterns, timed around a slightly different rhythm of rainfall and predator pressure than the herds just across the water. On the other side, an entirely separate lineage of the same general species has developed its own habits, its own wariness, its own subtle differences in size and colouring differences. A careful eye can spot today in preserved skeletal remains from either bank. Elephants moving along one side of a major river might never once across dozens of generations encounter the ivory poaching, or in earlier eras, the human hunting pressure faced by elephants only a short distance away on the other. Fish populations within the very same river sometimes split further still, adapting differently above and below a stretch of dangerous rapids that neither population could easily swim back through. Water, in other words, was not simply an obstacle sitting in the landscape. was quietly, patiently sorting the world into thousands of smaller, separate stories, each one unfolding without much awareness of the others. Early human groups lived inside that same sorting process whether they understood it or not. A band camped along one bank of a river in the Rift Valley of East Africa might have gone their entire lives without a single encounter with the band camped only a mile away on the opposite bank, not because the distance itself was so great, but because the water in between made that mile functionally uncrossable for most of the year. Over enough generations, small differences in tool-making style, in the particular way a group knapped flint or shaped a scraper, could drift apart entirely, not because one group taught the other something new, but because they simply stopped teaching each other anything at all. Archaeologists studying stone tool assemblages from opposite banks of certain ancient river systems have noted subtle, consistent differences that are difficult to explain by anything other than long-term separation populations that likely knew of each other's existence, perhaps even watched smoke rising from a distant cooking fire on the far side, and yet rarely if ever closed that final gap of water between them. Even burial practices where they survive well enough to study at all sometimes show this same quiet drift. Two groups descended from the same recent ancestors living less than a day's walk apart in a straight line might come to treat their dead in noticeably different ways within a handful of generations, one favouring a particular orientation of the body, a particular choice of judoka or shell ornament, the other developing its own version entirely independent of the first. Nothing about this required conflict or rivalry. It required only water and the slow, patient way that water turns a single people into two. This is where the deeper, quieter cause behind so much of human diversity begins to come into focus. It was not simply mountains or oceans or vast empty deserts that first divided our ancestors into distinct, slowly diverging populations. Rivers, modest and ordinary as they might look on a map today, did an enormous amount of that early sorting work long before anyone had a name for a species or a subspecies, long before anyone understood what was actually happening to their own bloodline, simply because their grandmother had once chosen to settle on this bank instead of that one. There is something worth sitting with in that thought for a moment. A person's entire genetic future, the shape of the face. Their great-grandchildren would carry the particular set of illnesses their descendants might prove resistant to the language that would eventually be spoken around their family's fire. All of it could hinge on something as unremarkable as which side of a river a small group of exhausted travellers happened to be standing on when the rains came early one particular year. There was no grand design in any of this. There was only water moving. The way water moves entirely indifferent to who it separated and who it allowed to stay together. The Nile offers another version of this same quiet sorting, though on a scale grand enough to shape entire civilizations later on, along its long course through what is now Egypt and Sudan. A series of rocky, turbulent stretches called cataracts once broke the river into distinct sections, each one nearly impossible to travel past by boat and difficult enough to cross on foot that they functioned for long stretches of prehistory, almost like separate countries stitched loosely along a single waterway. Communities living between one cataract and the next developed their own burial customs, their own pottery styles, their own particular way of shaping a spear point long before anyone living there would have called themselves Egyptian or Nubian or anything else. The evidence remains incomplete about exactly how much contact these river-segmented communities maintained with their neighbours upstream and downstream. But the physical remains, the styles of jewellery, the manner of grinding grain, tell a fairly clear story of populations that knew of each other, traded occasionally and yet largely developed apart, sorted by the same patient, indifferent hydrology that shaped the Congo, the Zambezi and countless smaller rivers whose names were never recorded anywhere at all. It is worth pausing here on something easy to miss. None of this sorting required a river to be enormous. Even a modest, unremarkable stream, one narrow enough that a strong adult could sometimes wade across it in the driest months, could still function as a near-total barrier the rest of the year, when seasonal rains transformed it into something unrecognizable. A river did not need to be the Congo or the Nile to reshape a population's future. It only needed to be reliably dangerous often enough and unpredictable enough in its danger that the risk of crossing rarely felt worth taking. Fear, it turns out, can be just as effective a wall as water itself, and the two reinforced each other for a very long time. And yet indifference is not the same as permanence. Even the most stubborn river eventually meets conditions that weaken its authority. A dry season severe enough to expose a crossable ford, a fallen tree wide and buoyant enough to carry more than its own branches, a narrow bend where the current finally slows enough for a strong swimmer to risk it. Those brief, unreliable windows, the moments when a river's wall briefly imperfectly opened, would end up mattering more to the future of our species than almost anything else happening on either bank at the time. Somewhere among all those small forgotten moments of hesitation at the water's edge, a very small number of people made a very different kind of choice, one that has left behind traces stranger and more difficult to explain than almost anything else in the story of how our species came to fill the earth. Somewhere in the deep past, on a morning that left no trace in any record we will ever recover, a dead tree finally gives way at the edge of a swollen river and slides into the current. It does not fall dramatically. It simply leans slowly the way old trees do, and then the water takes it, rolling it once, twice, before it steadies and begins to drift half-submerged out toward the middle of the channel. A group of early humans watching from the bank gathered there for some other reason entirely food-water. The simple habit of following a river's edge notices something about the way that tree moves. It does not sink. It rides the surface, awkward and slow, but it rides. This, more than any grand act of invention, is likely how the earliest human relationship with floating and crossing actually began. Not with a plan, not with a tool deliberately shaped for the purpose. With observation repeated over countless generations of the ordinary objects that already knew how to survive water long before any person did. Animals had been demonstrating this lesson for millions of years before a single hominin ever tried to learn from it. Logs floated. Mats of tangled vegetation torn loose during a flood floated. Occasionally an entire raft of debris built from nothing more than storm wreckage and drifting plant matter carried a passenger. Nobody had intended to send anywhere at all. In one of the more striking documented cases from the modern era, in the aftermath of a pair of powerful hurricanes that struck the Caribbean in the middle of the 1990s, a tangle of uprooted trees was seen washing ashore on the island of Anguilla, carrying a small group of green iguanas that had almost certainly begun their journey many miles away on the island of Guadeloupe. The iguanas survived the crossing. They went on to establish a population on an island their ancestors had never set foot on. Biologists studying the event realized they were watching in real time the same basic mechanism that had almost certainly been responsible for populating countless islands and river-divided landscapes across the entire history of life on Earth. A process scientists sometimes call sweepstakes dispersal because the outcome depends so heavily on chance rather than any deliberate effort by the creature involved. There is no reason to think early humans were exempt from this same basic process, at least at first. Long before anyone deliberately built a raft to cross a river on purpose, it is entirely plausible and increasingly considered likely by researchers studying the earliest human movements that some crossings happened essentially by accident. A person swept from a riverbank during a sudden flood, clinging desperately to whatever floating debris happened to be nearby, might occasionally survive far enough downstream or far enough across to wash up somewhere new alive, disoriented and now permanently separated from everyone and everything they had known only hours earlier. It's worth sitting for a moment with how genuinely difficult this would have been. Humans are not by the standards of the animal kingdom especially well built for swimming. Our bodies carry proportionally less buoyant fat than many marine mammals. Our limbs are not shaped for efficient propulsion through water, and unlike many primates, we do not have any strong instinctive swimming reflex present from birth. A frightened adult human, thrown suddenly into fast-moving water with no training and no floating object to hold on to, faces genuine immediate danger of drowning within minutes, regardless of how strong or capable that person might be on dry land. This is precisely why floating debris mattered so much. It did not require skill, it only required luck, and the simple physical fact that a large enough piece of wood displaces enough water to keep a struggling person's head above the surface a little longer than their own body alone ever could. Scholars still debate how much of early human water crossing was purely accidental, driven by flood and disaster, and how much gradually became something closer to intentional practice, people beginning to deliberately seek out floating logs before attempting a crossing, rather than simply hoping one would appear if disaster struck. The honest answer is probably that both were happening simultaneously for an extremely long stretch of prehistory, with accident teaching lessons that intention only slowly learned to apply. A survivor who had once been swept downstream clinging to a log and who had lived to tell the story around a fire that evening was passing along something genuinely valuable, even if neither they nor anyone listening fully understood it as a lesson in engineering. They were passing along the simple, hard-won knowledge that water which looked like certain death might, with the right piece of wood and the right amount of desperate luck, be survivable after all, over time. And this is where something resembling real intention likely begins to enter the story that knowledge probably started to shape behavior before a crisis ever forced the issue. A hunting party eyeing a herd of game visible on the opposite bank of a river, food that would otherwise remain permanently out of reach, had every reason to remember which kinds of wood floated best, which bends in the river ran slowest, and which time of year offered the calmest water. Certain trees with lighter, more porous wood would have proven themselves reliable again and again, while others dense and waterlogged within minutes would have earned a bad reputation quickly. The kind of hard, practical knowledge passed down through repetition rather than any written record. None of this required anything we would recognize today as a boat. It required only attention, patience, and a willingness to trust a half-submerged log with something as precious as one's own life, a trust that surely took root only after it had already been tested unwillingly by accident more than once. The physical evidence for any of this is understandably almost impossible to find directly. Wood does not survive tens of thousands of years the way stone does, and a raft made of nothing more than lashed branches and reeds leaves behind essentially nothing for an archaeologist to excavate. What survives instead is indirect, a scatter of stone tools appearing on a landmass that should have been unreachable without water crossing, a pattern of early human presence that spreads in ways difficult to explain by walking alone. The evidence remains incomplete in almost every specific case, and researchers are often left arguing over what a single unexpected find actually proved, but taken together across many different sites and many different centuries, the pattern is hard to dismiss entirely. Something or someone kept finding a way across water that should have stopped them. There is a quieter, more human layer buried inside all of this that is easy to miss if you focus only on the mechanics of floating wood and river currents. Consider what it must have meant emotionally to be the person who survived a crossing nobody else in the group had ever managed. To wash up on a bank you did not recognize, soaked and shaking, with no way of knowing whether your own people were still alive somewhere behind you, whether you would ever see them again, whether the land in front of you held food or predators or nothing at all. Some of the earliest human dispersal across the planet almost certainly began exactly this way, not as a bold planned expedition, but as one frightened, half-drowned person standing alone on an unfamiliar shore, forced to build an entirely new life because the water behind them had simply refused to let them go home. There would have been almost no way in that moment to know what had actually happened. A person raised entirely within a small band of relatives, who had perhaps never travelled more than a few days' walk from the place they were born, would have had no concept of currents, no understanding of how far a fast-moving river could carry a body before finally releasing it onto some unfamiliar bank. They would only have known cold and fear and the sudden, disorienting absence of every familiar landmark they had grown up trusting. Grief, in a very real sense, must have been one of the earliest and most common experiences tied to river crossing. Not the grief of losing someone else, but the strange, quiet grief of losing an entire world simply by being carried somewhere it never intended to send you. And yet survival, even under those conditions, tended to leave behind more than despair. A person who found themselves alone on a new shore with no immediate way back generally had exactly two options waiting to die or beginning, however reluctantly to learn the new land well enough to live in it. Most of what we know about how early humans adapted so successfully to such a wide range of environments is dense forest, high-altitude plateaus, coastal shorelines, likely traces back in part to exactly this kind of forced, unplanned relocation repeated many thousands of times across many thousands of years by people who never chose to become explorers but became something very close to it anyway. It is tempting, looking back from where we stand now, to imagine this process as slow and orderly, one careful step after another, gradually filling in the map of the ancient world. The reality was almost certainly far messier than that, full of dead ends, failed crossings, entire small groups who vanished into water and left no trace anyone would ever find. For every survivor who reached a new shore and eventually built a life there were very likely others whose attempts simply ended, quietly in the middle of a channel, unrecorded, unmourned by anyone beyond the small circle of people who had watched them go in and never watched them come out. History as it survives to us now is written almost entirely by the ones who made it across. The far larger number who did not make it left behind no record at all, no bones in the right place, no tool on the correct shore, nothing but an absence that no archaeologist could ever hope to measure. What makes the successful crossings so remarkable, then, is not simply that they happened, but that they happened often enough across such a long stretch of time that entire new populations eventually took root on the far side of rivers' coastlines and eventually almost unbelievably stretches of open ocean that no reasonable person would have expected any land-bound creature without a boat to cross alive. And some of those unwilling arrivals scattered by accident onto shores their ancestors never intended to reach ended up somewhere far stranger than a simple opposite riverbank. In certain places, the water that separated them from home was not a river at all, but open sea wide enough that no version of luck or the desperation should reasonably have carried anyone across it alive. And yet in more than one place on Earth, the evidence suggests that someone did. There is a line running through the islands of Southeast Asia that appears on no ancient map and was never marked by any monument, and yet for millions of years it functioned as one of the most absolute borders life on Earth has ever known. A British naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace first noticed it in the middle of the 1800s while collecting specimens across the islands of what is now Indonesia. He kept finding something that made no obvious sense. On one small island, the local wildlife looked distinctly Asian. Tigers, elephants, monkeys closely related to species found on the mainland. On the very next island, sometimes separated by a strait only a few dozen miles wide, the wildlife suddenly looked almost entirely different, closer to the marsupials and unusual birds found in Australia half a world away. Wallace eventually traced the boundary between these two very different worlds, and it became known appropriately enough as the Wallace Line. What makes the Wallace Line so strange is not simply that two different sets of animals happen to live on either side of it. Plenty of places on Earth have that. What makes it strange is the reason those animals never mixed even during the many long ice ages, when sea levels around the world dropped low enough to connect almost every other nearby island by dry land. Across most of that region, a person or an elephant or a tiger could once have walked for enormous distances across exposed seabed that has been underwater again for thousands of years now. But the specific channel running through the middle of the Wallace Line in particular, the strait separating the islands of Bali and Lombok, never closed. It stayed deep water permanently through every ice age humanity has ever lived through. Whatever crossed that particular gap did not walk. It had no choice but to somehow go by water in a stretch of open sea that has remained essentially unbridgeable by the land for as long as our species has existed. This is where the story of early crossing stops being only about rivers and becomes something considerably stranger. Wallace himself never fully understood why the boundary he had noticed held so firm. He lacked any knowledge of Ice Age's continental shelves or the deep ocean trenches that would eventually explain what his own eyes had already told him. He simply trusted the pattern recorded carefully across years of exhausting fieldwork in difficult, often dangerous conditions, and left the explanation for later generations of scientists to work out using tools he could never have imagined. It is a small, almost humbling reminder that some of the most important discoveries in the history of science begin not with a theory but with a patient, curious person simply noticing that something does not quite add up. It helps before going further to understand just how thin the line really is on a map and how deceptively ordinary it looks from the deck of a boat today. A traveller sailing from Bali to Lombok crosses barely 20 miles of open water, a distance easily covered in an afternoon with land visible on both sides for almost the entire journey. Nothing about the view suggests one of the most consequential biological boundaries on the planet. The strait looks calm, unremarkable, the kind of crossing a modern traveller might not think twice about. And yet beneath that calm surface lies a channel plunging to depths of well over 1,000 feet, in places a drop steep and permanent enough that no amount of Ice Age cooling, no matter how severe, ever managed to expose a path across it. Every other nearby strait in the region shrank or vanished entirely during the coldest periods of the Ice Ages. This one quietly, stubbornly never did. In the year 2003, a team of researchers excavating a limestone cave on the island of Flores, deep on the far side of that same Wallace Line, uncovered something that genuinely startled the scientific community. The remains belonged to a small human relative standing barely over 3 feet tall as an adult, with a skull and brain noticeably smaller than anything expected from a species living as recently as tens of thousands of years ago. Researchers eventually gave this newly discovered relative a formal scientific name, but almost immediately in labs and newsrooms around the world, people started calling these small island-dwelling humans by a gentler, more familiar nickname, borrowed from a beloved fictional creature of roughly the same size. The hobbits of Flores, as they quickly became known, had apparently been living successfully on that isolated island for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, adapting generation after generation to a world that the rest of humanity could not easily reach and that they in turn could not easily leave. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is not simply that a small isolated population of ancient humans lived on Flores. It is how they most likely got there in the first place. Stone tools recovered from deeper, older layers on the same island have been dated to roughly 1 million years old, tens of thousands of generations before the more familiar story of early modern humans crossing oceans is generally believed to have begun. The species responsible for those earliest tools was almost certainly an early form of Homo erectus, a human ancestor with a brain considerably smaller than our own. not previously believed by most researchers to have been capable of anything resembling deliberate planned sea travel. And yet there they were, evidently on the far side of a channel that never closed even at the height of the driest, coldest ice ages, when nearly every other nearby island in the region briefly became part of the mainland. How does a species without anything close to our own capacity for complex, abstract planning end up establishing a lasting population on an island it could never have simply walked to? The honest answer is that no one fully knows, and the scholars who study this question most closely remain genuinely divided over it. Some researchers lean toward the explanation we have already spent time with: repeated accidental rafting, storm after storm, generation after generation, occasionally sweeping small groups of Homo erectus out to sea on tangled mats of vegetation and uprooted trees, with just enough of those unwilling voyages ending in survival to eventually establish a breeding population on the far shore. Other researchers find that explanation difficult to accept as the sole cause, given how many separate, successful crossings would likely have been needed simply to establish a stable, lasting population, rather than a single-stranded doomed group. The evidence remains incomplete on this point, and it may remain that way permanently, since the very rafts or logs involved, whatever they were, would never have survived the passage of that much time. What is not in dispute is what happened to that population once it arrived. Islands, it turns out, have a strange and consistent effect on the size of the animals. Stranded on them, an effect biologists sometimes call the island rule. Large animals isolated on a small island, cut off from the wider gene pool and often facing genuinely limited food resources, tend over many generations to shrink. Small animals, freed in many cases from the predators that once kept them cautious and small on the mainland, tend instead to grow larger. Flores itself offers a strikingly clear example of both directions happening at once. The same island that produced these unusually small isolated humans also once hosted an unusually small species of elephant relative, alongside enormous storks and giant rats that had grown considerably larger than their mainland relatives ever managed to. It is a strange, almost dreamlike ecosystem to imagine, one shaped entirely by the fact that a single channel of deep water had quietly sealed an entire island away from the rest of the world for the better part of 1,000,000 years. For the small human population living inside that sealed world, none of this would have felt strange at all. It would simply have been life generation folding quietly into generation on an island that offered everything they needed and demanded in return a body built to survive within its particular limits. There is something worth pausing on here, something easy to rush past in a story built around striking discoveries and unexpected fossils. These were not a lesser or failed version of humanity stranded and struggling. Best available evidence suggests they endured on Flores for the better part of 1,000,000 years, longer than every version of our own species combined has yet managed to exist. Whatever hardship came with that isolation, and there was almost certainly a great deal of it, disease-limited food during lean seasons, the total absence of any wider human world to trade with or learn from, it was a hardship this population apparently learned to survive across an almost unimaginable span of time. What did daily life actually look like for a population this small, this isolated, for so many hundreds of thousands of years? The honest answer is that we can only reconstruct fragments of it. Stone tools recovered alongside their remains suggest they hunted the island's own miniature elephant relatives, working cooperatively enough to bring down prey considerably larger than themselves, a detail that hints at social coordination and shared knowledge passed down across generations, even without any of the wider cultural exchange that shaped human development almost everywhere else on Earth. They likely never encountered another human population at all, not once, for the vast majority of their long history on that island. Every skill, every tool design, Every strategy for surviving a lean season had to be worked out, remembered, and passed forward entirely within their own small, self-contained world. Their story ends, as far as researchers can currently tell, sometime between 50 and 60,000 years ago, though scholars still debate the exact timing and the exact cause. Some researchers point to a documented volcanic eruption on the island around that period, one severe enough to have devastated local food sources and habitat. Others suspect the arrival of modern humans in the region, our own species finally reaching Flores after its own long journey out of Africa, may have played some role as well, whether through direct contact competition for increasingly scarce resources, or simply the slow displacement that so often follows when two different human populations end up sharing the same limited island. The evidence does not yet allow a confident answer, and it is entirely possible, though far from certain, that both causes contributed something to how that ancient population's long isolated story eventually came to a close. What Flores leaves behind, more than any single explanation, is a quiet correction to how most of us have probably imagined the story of early human movement. It is tempting to picture that movement as a steady outward march across dry land, one continent giving way gradually to the next. The reality, at least in this one remarkable corner of the ancient world, looks considerably stranger and considerably more improvised than that, a story built as much on water as on walking, and as much on accident as on any deliberate plan. Findings on nearby islands, including Sulawesi and Luzon, have turned up their own small distinctive human relatives and their own unexpectedly ancient stone tools, discoveries that arrived years apart from entirely different research teams, and yet kept telling remarkably similar versions of the same improbable story. Taken together, these scattered island discoveries suggest that whatever crossed the Wallace Line all those hundreds of thousands of years ago was not a single, isolated stroke of luck. It happened more than once in more than one place across an extraordinarily long stretch of time, which raises a genuinely open question that continues to occupy researchers today. If crossings like this happened so many times in so many different places, was it ever truly only chance, or had something closer to a working, if entirely unspoken method of crossing quietly taken shape long before anyone alive today would have expected it to? Other islands scattered across that same difficult stretch of ocean carry their own version of the same quiet mystery and their own version of the same unanswered question about who exactly first found a way across water that should never have let them through. Not every decision made at the edge of a river was about food or migration or the slow drift of one population away from another. Sometimes it was smaller than that and far more personal, a single ordinary afternoon in which the entire future of one particular family quietly hung in the balance, unnoticed by anyone beyond the small group standing at the water's edge. Picture a man standing on the bank of a river, somewhere in what is now Central Europe, close to 20,000 years ago, during one of the coldest stretches of the last great ice age. The river in front of him is not the warm, slow-moving water we might imagine from earlier in this story. It is glacial meltwater fed by ice sheets sitting only days away to the north, running fast and startlingly cold even in the warmer months of the year. Cold water carries its own particular danger, one separate from the current itself. A body plunged suddenly into water, this frigid can lose real strength and coordination. Within moments, long before exhaustion or distance would ordinarily become a concern. His son, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, walks close beside him, small hand wrapped tightly around 2 of his father's fingers, the way children do when the world around them suddenly feels larger and less certain than usual. The group they are travelling with, extended family, a handful of others, bound together by kinship and long habit, has crossed rivers before. They know the drill. The strongest adults form a rough chain across the shallowest stretch. They can find bracing against the current while children and the elderly move between them, passed carefully from one steady grip to the next, a method almost certainly refined over countless earlier crossings, most of them uneventful, most of them never remembered by anyone beyond the people who lived through them. This crossing goes wrong the way these things usually did, quietly and without warning. A stone shifts underfoot in the riverbed, invisible beneath the murky, fast-moving water. An adult stumbles just for a moment, just long enough for a grip to loosen. The boy is pulled from his father's hand by a current that offers no patience for hesitation and no interest in how small or precious the person it has taken happens to be. What follows lasts only seconds, a father lunging forward against a current far stronger than his own body, other hands reaching a moment of complete and total chaos in otherwise deep cold water. Sometimes in stories like this one, the child is pulled back out, shaking, terrified but alive. Sometimes he is not. Either way, an ordinary afternoon that had started with nothing more dramatic than the need to reach better hunting ground on the far side of a river ends, instead, with a family standing on a cold riverbank, changed forever by roughly 10 seconds of moving water. This is not one single documented event pulled from a specific archaeological site. It is instead something that almost certainly happened many thousands of times across the long span of human prehistory, a pattern so common that it left its quiet mark on how ancient people understood danger itself. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to exact numbers from this deep in the past, since a small body lost to a fast-moving river rarely leaves anything behind for an archaeologist to eventually find. But researchers who study mortality patterns among modern hunter-gatherer societies, communities that still live today in ways that echo, however imperfectly, the conditions of deep prehistory, have found something worth sitting with quietly. Long-term demographic studies of groups such as the Ache of Paraguay and the Hadza of Tanzania, conducted by anthropologists tracking birth and death records across entire communities over many years, consistently list drowning as one of the leading causes of accidental death among young children, often ranking close to predator attacks and disease in terms of overall risk. There is no strong reason to think the deeper past looked meaningfully different. If anything, without any of the safety knowledge modern parents take entirely for granted, the risk was almost certainly higher. What makes this particular danger different from almost everything else we have discussed so far is how ordinary it was. A person did not need to be attempting some grand, ambitious crossing to lose a child to a river. They only needed to be doing something as unremarkable as moving camp following food or simply fetching water, a little too close to a bank that looked stable but was not. The rivers that shaped so much of the deep human story were not only barriers to migration and dividers of populations, they were also quietly and constantly one of the single greatest threats to the smallest and most vulnerable members of every single group that ever lived near one. Grief under these conditions could not have been rare, and yet very little about how ancient people actually processed that grief survives in any form we can directly examine. What does survive in a small number of remarkable cases suggests something worth pausing on. At a site called Sungir in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered a burial dating back roughly 34,000 years containing 2 children, a boy and a girl, buried head-to-head in a single grave, covered from head to toe in an almost overwhelming quantity of carefully carved ivory beads, thousands of them, along with spears made from straightened mammoth tusk pendants and other objects that would have required an enormous investment of time and skill to produce. Researchers estimate that a single strand of those beads alone may have taken many hours of careful patient work to complete, and the grave contained thousands of strands. Nobody knows exactly how these 2 children died. The evidence does not point clearly toward drowning or any other single cause, and researchers studying the site are careful not to overstate what the burial can and cannot tell us. What the burial does tell us unmistakably is how deeply a community from this same era, this same difficult Ice Age world, was capable of grieving its youngest members. Whatever took those two children from their families, the adults left behind did not simply move on. They built something extraordinary in response, a monument of ivory and care that has now survived for over 30,000 years, far longer than any structure of stone or wood from the same period. It is worth returning for a moment to the family on that cold riverbank and to the countless other families across countless other rivers who faced some version of that same terrible instant. What did they do afterward? How does a small group of people entirely dependent on each other for survival continue moving forward the very next morning, when moving forward is the only option available to them? There is no single answer, and scholars who study grief in small scale, close-knit societies caution against assuming ancient people processed loss the same way modern individuals often do, privately internally at their own pace. In many small communities, both ancient and more recent grief tends to be something shared immediately and openly carried collectively by the entire group rather than shouldered alone by the parents. A father who lost his son at a river crossing was very likely not left to carry that loss in isolation. The whole group carried it, if only because the whole group depended on each other too completely to allow anyone to disappear into private mourning for very long. Ethnographic accounts from more recent traditional societies recorded by anthropologists over the past century or more, among communities still living close to the land, offer a glimpse of what this shared mourning might have looked like in practice. In many such accounts, the entire camp pauses its ordinary routine for a period of days hunting and gathering, continuing only enough to keep everyone fed, while the group as a whole performs whatever rituals its particular culture has developed around loss, often involving shared food, shared silence, and the deliberate repeated retelling of the lost child's short life by every adult who knew them. There is no reason to assume Ice Age communities were fundamentally different in this respect. Grief, it seems, has almost always needed company to be survivable at all, and small, tightly bound groups of early humans were, if nothing else, remarkably well practiced at surviving together. None of this made the loss smaller. It simply meant the loss belonged in some real sense to everyone standing on that riverbank and to every child who crossed water again after that day with a slightly firmer grip, a slightly greater caution passed down. Not as a lesson written anywhere, but as something felt quietly in the tightened hand of an adult who remembered exactly what a moment of loosened attention could cost. Fear of this kind repeated across enough generations and enough separate communities has a way of settling into culture even when no single person ever decides to put it there deliberately. It is difficult to say with certainty where the earliest human instinct to treat rivers as something almost alive, something to be respected, appeased or approached with quiet ceremony first began. Scholars still debate how much of that instinct traces directly back to losses like this one, and how much emerge from other sources. Entirely, the simple unpredictability of moving water or older instincts shared with other animals that also treat deep water with instinctive caution. What does seem clear looking across countless unrelated cultures separated by enormous distances and enormous stretches of time is that an unusually large number of them independently arrived at some version of the same idea that a river deserved to be approached carefully, sometimes even asked for permission before a family trusted it with the people they loved most. Rivers, in other words, extracted a very particular kind of tax from early human communities, one measured not in migration routes or divided populations, but in small personal losses that rippled outward through an entire group and shaped in ways we can only partly reconstruct now how carefully every future crossing was approached. It is easy from a comfortable distance of tens of thousands of years to think of prehistoric danger mainly in terms of predators crouched in tall grass or sudden violence between rival groups. Water asked for something quieter, and in its own way something far more constant. It didn't need to hunt anyone, it only needed to wait. There is a particular kind of caution that develops in a community only after loss, and it tends to look very different from caution born of instruction alone. A child taught simply to be careful near water learns one thing. A child raised inside a community that has actually lost someone to a river and that still quietly remembers it learns something considerably deeper. A caution woven into the very rhythm of daily life, rather than a rule recited once and easily forgotten. Anthropologists who have spent time with river-dependent communities in more recent history often note this same pattern, an almost instinctive vigilance around water, that outsiders sometimes mistake for excessive fear, but that insiders understand as something closer to inherited memory, passed down from a specific loss that most of them can no longer name, but all of them somehow still carry. It is tempting to imagine that this vigilance repeated across enough generations eventually made river crossing safe, or at least safe enough that families stopped fearing it entirely. That was almost never true. Caution reduced the risk, it never eliminated it. Rivers remained genuinely dangerous for essentially the entire span of human prehistory, and the knowledge passed down from one grieving family to the next mattered less because it prevented every future loss, and more because it occasionally quietly prevented one, and water, as it turned out, was rarely alone in that waiting. Along many of the same riverbanks where families gathered to cross, other eyes were watching, too patient in their own entirely different way, and just as willing to take advantage of a single moment when a group's attention had drifted somewhere else. A predator does not need to be fast to be effective. It only needs to be patient and willing to wait somewhere its prey has no reason to expect it. Along the rivers of ancient Africa, that patience belonged more than to almost any other animal to something lying motionless just beneath the surface, indistinguishable from a floating log until the very last instant it chose not to be. The evidence for how much crocodiles actually shaped early human behavior does not come from guesswork or reasonable assumption alone. It comes in at least one remarkable case directly from the bones themselves. At Olduvai Gorge, a site in Tanzania that has produced some of the most important fossil discoveries in the entire history of human origins. Researchers examining a set of ancient foot bones belonging to an early human relative noticed something unusual, a series of puncture marks and gouges that did not match any known form of natural decay or later damage. Careful comparison eventually identified the marks as almost certainly the bite pattern of an ancient crocodile, closely matching the spacing and depth of teeth, belonging to a species that once grew considerably larger than the crocodiles found in the same region today. The foot in question likely belonged to someone standing at the water's edge close to 2 million years ago, going about some ordinary task, drinking, fishing, or simply crossing to the other side when the water beside them turned out to be considerably less empty than it appeared. This is not, it should be said clearly, proof of a single dramatic hunt captured perfectly in stone. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret marks like these, since bite patterns can sometimes result from scavenging after death rather than an active attack, and the fossil record rarely offers enough context to say with total confidence which scenario actually occurred. But taken together with a broader pattern of similar marks found on other ancient bones, from similar riverside and lakeside sites across East Africa, the evidence points strongly toward crocodiles having been a real persistent and genuinely significant danger to early human relatives for an extraordinarily long stretch of prehistory, quite possibly longer than almost any other single predator threat our ancestors faced. What makes a crocodile such an effective predator at the water's edge is not raw speed or overwhelming size, though. A fully grown individual certainly has both. It is the particular patient nature of how it hunts. A crocodile can remain almost entirely motionless for hours submerged, except for a small ridge of eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface, indistinguishable at a glance from a floating branch or a half-sunken stone. It does not chase. It waits for something to come close enough to the water's edge, close enough to drink, to wash, to reach for a floating piece of fruit, and then it moves with a sudden explosive burst of speed that closes the distance in less than a second, followed by a powerful bite and an immediate pull backward into deeper water. A hunting method specifically built around denying any prey animal a meaningful chance to react. Modern researchers who study crocodile hunting behavior have measured just how deceptive this stillness really is. A crocodile's resting metabolism is remarkably low enough that an individual can go weeks between meals without any real cost to its health, which means it can afford to wait motionless for far longer than almost any warm-blooded predator ever could. There is no restlessness to give it away, no shifting of weight, no visible impatience. For an early human approaching a familiar stretch of riverbank, this stillness would have offered no reliable warning at all. The water might have looked exactly the same on the one day nothing happened as it did on the one day something did. Early humans drawn to rivers for exactly the same reasons crocodiles waited beside them. Water fish, the animals that gathered nearby to drink, would have found themselves in a genuinely difficult bind. The very features that made a riverbank valuable easy access to water, abundant food, a gentle slope for approaching the current, were often the same features that made a particular stretch of bank ideal crocodile territory as well. Avoiding rivers entirely was never a realistic option. Learning which specific stretches of river tended to hide the most danger, however, almost certainly became one of the earliest and most valuable pieces of practical knowledge any early human community could possess. Crocodiles were far from the only danger lurking beneath the surface. In many of the same rivers and lakes across ancient Africa, hippopotamuses presented a completely different kind of threat, one built not around patient ambush but around sudden, overwhelming aggression. A hippo does not hunt in any conventional sense. It is technically an herbivore uninterested in eating the animals or people that come near it. But a hippo defending its territory, or simply startled by an unexpected presence, too close to the water, can charge with tremendous speed and force, and its bite powered by an enormous jaw, capable of opening far wider than most people expect, is genuinely capable of crushing bone with ease. Even today, in regions of Africa where hippos remain common, wildlife researchers and conservation officials frequently note that hippos are responsible for more human deaths annually than lions, leopards, or crocodiles combined, a statistic that continues to surprise people who assume the more dramatic-looking predators pose the greater risk. There is no reason to think the situation was meaningfully different. Tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, when early humans lived in far closer, far more constant proximity to hippo populations than almost anyone alive today. What made hippos especially unpredictable compared to the more calculable danger of a crocodile was the sheer difficulty of reading their mood from a distance. A hippo resting quietly in shallow water might tolerate a nearby presence for hours without incident, only to suddenly charge without any obvious warning. If something about the situation shifted, an unfamiliar smell carried on the wind, a young calf feeling crowded, a bull defending breeding rights against a rival that never actually appeared. Early human groups sharing a river with a resident hippo population would have had to learn through trial and often through loss the particular temperament of that specific group, knowledge that had almost no value anywhere else since the next river over, with its own hippos and its own history, demanded the whole lesson be learned again from the beginning. The danger these animals posed was not evenly distributed across every stretch of every river. It concentrated the way danger so often does in specific identifiable places, a particular bend where the current slowed just enough to make it an attractive crocodile ambush. Cite a particular pool where a resident hippo defended the same stretch of water year after year, over enough generations. Early human communities almost certainly developed something we might now recognize as an oral map of danger, a body of accumulated local knowledge likely passed down through story and direct instruction marking which crossings were relatively safe and which ones had a history worth remembering. We have no written record of this knowledge, of course, since writing itself would not exist for hundreds of thousands of years after crocodiles and hippos first began shaping how early humans approached water. But the underlying logic is difficult to avoid. A community that lost members repeatedly at one particular crossing, and that survived more consistently at another, further downstream or upstream had every practical reason to remember the difference, and every practical reason to pass that memory along to their children long before those children were old enough to test the danger themselves. What would it have meant practically to grow up inside a community holding knowledge like this? A child raised near a river almost certainly learned well before they could have articulated why, which parts of the bank felt safe to approach and which parts carried an unspoken wariness in the adults around them, a tension in the shoulders, a habit of scanning the water's surface before wading in, passed down not as an explicit lesson, but as something absorbed simply by watching how the people they trusted most behaved. Fear transmitted this way tends to be remarkably durable. It does not require full understanding to be effective. It only requires consistency repeated often enough across enough generations that caution near certain waters became something closer to instinct than active calculation. Danger did not always announce itself through teeth or territory either. Rivers in certain regions, particularly those fed by distant mountain rainfall rather than local weather, carried a danger that could arrive with almost no warning at all. A community camped safely beside a dry or gently flowing riverbed might wake to find the water rising rapidly, sometimes within a single hour, driven by a storm that had fallen entirely out of their own sight, days away and days upstream. Flash floods of this kind remain a documented hazard in many of the same arid and semi-arid regions across Africa and the Middle East today, and there is little reason to think the underlying pattern looks different in the deep past. A riverbed that had sat comfortably dry for weeks, inviting a camp to settle unusually close to its banks, could transform within minutes into a genuine life-threatening torrent, catching people and belongings alike with no meaningful opportunity to react. This particular danger required a different kind of knowledge than avoiding a crocodile's favourite ambush point and understanding not of the river, directly in front of a group, but of weather and geography happening somewhere else, entirely learned only through hard experience passed down across generations who had watched more than once a peaceful riverbed turn without warning into something else completely. Predators were not the only threat hidden beneath a calm-looking surface either. Many rivers across the ancient world carried invisible to the naked eye various parasites and waterborne organisms capable of causing serious, sometimes fatal illness over time, a slower, less dramatic danger than a crocodile's ambush, but a genuinely significant one nonetheless. Communities that drew their drinking water and washed their bodies in the same stretch of river used by dozens or hundreds of other people and animals faced a level of exposure to disease that modern sanitation has made almost impossible for most of us to fully imagine today. One particular parasitic illness, now generally known as schistosomiasis, spread through certain species of freshwater snail, found across many of the same African river systems inhabited by early humans, and researchers studying its evolutionary history believe the relationship between this parasite and humans likely stretches back an extraordinarily long time, possibly touching some of the very same populations we have been discussing throughout this story. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how much of early human mortality traced back to these slower, invisible dangers, rather than the more dramatic threats of drowning or predation, since disease of this kind leaves very little trace in the archaeological record. What seems certain from everything researchers have been able to piece together is that water was never simply an obstacle or a resource in the ancient world. It was a genuinely complicated relationship, offering life with one hand and very real, sometimes hidden danger with the other in almost perfect, unrelenting balance. Rivers then are something of early human communities that few other landscapes demanded quite so consistently. A working, constantly updated understanding of exactly where danger tended to gather, held not in any written form but in the accumulated, quietly passed down memory of every family that had ever lost someone or nearly lost someone to a particular stretch of water. That memory, fragile and unwritten as it was, would eventually prove to be one of the most valuable things any prehistoric community could carry with it. It's worth pausing briefly on how differently this kind of knowledge would have felt from something like a modern warning sign or a printed map. There was no single moment when a community sat down and decided to record which crossings were dangerous. The knowledge accumulated the way scars accumulate, one incident at a time, each one adding a small specific detail to a much larger unwritten understanding shared by everyone who had grown up nearby. A particular bend might come to be associated wordlessly with a certain unease that every adult in the group seemed to share without ever fully explaining why. A younger member of the group, arriving new to the area through marriage or migration, would have had to learn this same map essentially from scratch, watching carefully, asking quietly until the invisible boundaries the rest of the group already carried became visible to them as well. And in a small handful of remarkable places, some of that memory did not entirely vanish. It left behind something more durable, something pressed directly into the ground itself, waiting patiently for someone tens of thousands of years later to notice it was there at all. Mud remembers things that water almost always forgets. A river erases its own history within hours, the current rearranging itself, constantly leaving nothing behind to mark where a person once stood. But the soft, drying edge of an ancient lake or wetland, under precisely the right conditions, can hold the shape of a single footstep for longer than entire civilizations have existed quietly, waiting layer after layer for someone to eventually come looking. In a place now called White Sands in what is today the state of New Mexico, researchers working near the dried bed of an ancient lake made a discovery in recent years. Much of the archaeological community, preserved in layers of old lakeshore sediment, they found an extensive series of human footprints, hundreds of them left by people walking, running, and in some cases clearly carrying small children along the damp margin of a lake that no longer exists. Using a dating method that measures the age of ancient seeds embedded directly in the same sediment layers as the footprints, researchers arrived at an age of roughly 21 to 23,000 years, a figure that, if correct, places people walking through that landscape considerably earlier than the timeline most archaeologists had confidently accepted for how long humans have lived in the Americas. The lake itself long since evaporated into the flat, dazzling gypsum desert that gives the site its modern name would have looked almost nothing like the landscape a visitor sees there today. Researchers reconstructing the ancient environment describe shallow, marshy shorelines, seasonal flooding, and enough surrounding vegetation to support the mammoths, giant ground sloths and dire wolves whose own footprints appear interspersed among the human ones in the same layers of mud, occasionally close enough to suggest genuinely tense encounters between people and enormous animals sharing the exact same narrow strip of walkable shoreline. This is where the evidence becomes genuinely contentious in the most productive sense of that word. Scholars still debate whether the dating at White Sands is fully accurate, since dating ancient seeds carries its own set of technical challenges, and a small number of researchers have raised legitimate questions about whether older carbon could have contaminated the samples in ways that might make them appear artificially ancient. Other researchers, using entirely separate dating techniques on the same layers, have since reported results falling within a similar range, which has strengthened confidence in the original findings considerably, though the debate has not fully settled even now. What almost everyone studying the site agrees on regardless of where they land on the exact dating question is that the footprints themselves are unmistakably real and unmistakably human, walked by real people going about real, ordinary tasks along the edge of a lake that has long since dried into desert. It is worth understanding why a question like this matters so much to researchers beyond simple scientific curiosity. For decades, the broadly accepted timeline for human arrival in the Americas centered on a particular set of stone tools, distinctive enough to be given their own name, first identified at a site in New Mexico and dated to a little over 13,000 years ago. That timeline shaped an enormous amount of research teaching and public understanding for most of the 20th century, treated by many in the field as settled fact, rather than an ongoing hypothesis. Footprints considerably older than that figure, if their dating holds up under continued scrutiny, would not simply add a few extra centuries to the story. They would suggest that people were living, walking and raising children in North America thousands of years earlier than most textbooks currently teach, a genuinely significant revision to a chapter of human history that had felt to many researchers largely settled. Among the thousands of individual footprints recorded at the site, one particular trackway has drawn an unusual amount of attention, not for what it proves scientifically, but for what it seems to capture almost by accident of one small human moment. Researchers traced a single set of prints extending for well over a mile in one direction, made by someone walking with a noticeably heavier, less even gait than the surrounding tracks, consistent with carrying real weight on one hip. Smaller, occasional prints appear briefly alongside the larger set at certain points, as though a small child was set down for a moment, walked a few steps independently, and was then picked back up and carried again. The same trackway eventually turns around and heads back in the opposite direction, this time noticeably lighter, faster, without any trace of a second, smaller set of footprints accompanying it. Researchers studying the site are careful appropriately not to overinterpret a single trackway or assume they know exactly what happened. It could represent a parent carrying a tired child on one leg of an ordinary errand and returning alone because the child was left safely elsewhere. It is impossible this many thousands of years later to know for certain, but it is difficult looking at the data laid out on a map not to feel the outline of an entire small ordinary human afternoon, preserved by pure accident in mud that nobody involved could ever have imagined would still be readable this many thousands of years later. White Sands is remarkable, but it is far from the only place where ancient mud has preserved something this specific. On the eastern coast of England, near a town called Happisburgh, a team of researchers working along an eroding stretch of beach in the early years of this century uncovered something even older. A set of footprints pressed into ancient estuary mud dating back somewhere between 800,000 and 950,000 years, making them, at the time of their discovery, the oldest confirmed hominin footprints ever found outside the African continent. The prints had been left along the muddy margin of an ancient river mouth where a slow-moving waterway once emptied into the sea by a small group that researchers believe likely included both adults and at least one or two children based on the range of foot sizes preserved in the mud. What makes the Happisburgh footprints especially poignant beyond their genuinely startling age is how fleeting their second life turned out to be. The layer of ancient mud holding them had been buried and protected for the better part of 1,000,000 years, only to be gradually exposed again by ordinary coastal erosion in the modern era. Researchers who studied the site knew from the very beginning that they were working against a clock they could not control. Within only a few weeks of their discovery being properly documented, recorded and photographed, the same tides that had uncovered the footprints in the first place finished the job of washing them away entirely, returning that particular patch of shoreline to ordinary unmarked mud. What survives today exists only in photographs' three-dimensional scans, and the careful notes of the researchers who happened to reach that stretch of beach at exactly the right moment in an extraordinarily long and mostly invisible window of opportunity. There is something worth sitting with in that timing. A set of footprints that had waited undisturbed for the better part of 1,000,000 years was given only a matter of weeks to be seen by anyone at all, before vanishing again, this time permanently. It raises a quiet, almost uncomfortable question that is easy to brush past too quickly. How many other trackways like this one, just as old, just as significant, have already been exposed briefly by tide or wind or shifting riverbank, somewhere on Earth, and then erased again before a single person ever happened to walk past and notice them? The researchers involved at Happisburgh have spoken since about the strange, almost bitter-sweet nature of that discovery, aware from the outset that they were racing a clock measured not in months or years, but in the ordinary indifferent rhythm of the tide. Every photograph taken, every careful measurement recorded mattered enormously precisely because there would be no second opportunity, no returning next season for a closer look. In a field built largely around patient, methodical work conducted over years or decades, Happisburgh offered something rarer, a genuine race against time, fought not against a rival research team, but against the sea itself. Further evidence of ancient trackways near water comes from a very different part of the world, entirely along the shore of an ancient lake near a place called Illoret in northern Kenya. Their researchers have identified multiple layers of footprints dating back roughly 1.5 million years, made by an early human relative walking along what was once a muddy lakeshore in a landscape that would have looked in many ways remarkably similar to the riverside and lakeside settings we've already spent considerable time exploring in this story. What makes the Illoret prints scientifically significant is not simply their age, but what they reveal about how their makers actually moved. Careful analysis of the pressure patterns left in the ancient mud shows a walking gait strikingly similar to that of modern humans, with a similar distribution of weight across the foot and a similar big toe positioned in line with the rest of the foot rather than splayed to the side the way it is in most other primates. This is a detail easy to overlook if you're not looking for it. And yet it tells researchers something genuinely important, that the basic biomechanics of upright human walking, the very same stride carrying someone toward a dangerous river crossing or away from a crocodile's ambush point, had already been essentially fixed in place well over 1,000,000 years before anyone alive today was born. The Illoret site offers something else worth pausing on, a detail that becomes visible only once researchers compare multiple separate layers of footprints stacked one above another, in the same location, each one representing a different visit to the same muddy shoreline, separated in some cases by years or even decades of accumulated sediment in between. The same narrow strip of walkable lakeshore was apparently used again and again by different individuals across a considerable span of time, suggesting this particular crossing point held some kind of lasting practical value, whether as a reliable place to reach fresh water, a favoured fishing spot, or simply the easiest, safest stretch of shoreline available in an otherwise difficult landscape. It is a small, quiet echo of the same oral map of danger and safety we discussed earlier in this story, except here unusually the map itself has left a physical trace layer stacked upon layer, each one a slightly different generation choosing for reasons of their own to walk across almost exactly the same patch of ground. What ties all of these scattered footprints together, separated as they are by continents and by enormous stretches of time, is the particular fragile combination of conditions required for any of them to survive at all. The mud has to be exactly the right consistency, wet enough to hold a clear impression, but not so wet that it simply collapses back over the footprint within moments. It then has to be covered relatively quickly by a protective layer of additional sediment, sealing the print away from the erosion, weather, and animal traffic that would otherwise destroy it within days or even hours. And finally, after surviving underground for anywhere from tens of thousands to well over 1 million years, it has to be exposed again at precisely the right moment by natural forces like coastal erosion or a shifting riverbed, and discovered by someone equipped with the knowledge and patience to recognize what they are actually looking at rather than simply walking past an unremarkable patch of hardened mud. Consider for a moment everything that has to align correctly for even one of these fragile records to survive its full journey from ordinary footstep to scientific discovery. The person leaving the print has to walk across ground of precisely the right dampness on a day when no heavy rain arrives to wash it away before it can harden even slightly. Sediment has to settle over it gently rather than washing it out entirely, a process that can take anywhere from a single season to many years depending on the local environment. The site then has to avoid disturbance from burrowing animals, root systems, or later human activity for the full length of its burial, sometimes spanning an almost incomprehensible stretch of geological time. And finally, purely by chance erosion excavation or a construction project has to expose that exact layer at a moment when a person trained to recognize its significance happens to be standing nearby, rather than a season, a decade, or an entire century too early or too late. Given how narrow that window of preservation and discovery really is, every single trackway we've discussed represents an almost unreasonably lucky survival, a brief accidental window into an ordinary moment that was never meant to last, made permanent by nothing more than the particular chemistry of wet ground on one particular afternoon. For every trackway that has survived long enough to be studied, there were almost certainly countless others made by people crossing rivers, avoiding predators, carrying children that vanished within hours, washed away by the very water their makers had just finished crossing, leaving no trace for anyone ever to find. It is worth remembering too that footprints are not the only kind of evidence patiently waiting in the ground for this same rare combination of luck and timing to bring it back into the light. Elsewhere, in places far from any preserved lake shore or estuary, an entirely different kind of clue has occasionally surfaced, less a single frozen moment than a scattered, puzzling trail of objects and materials that, taken together, hint at journeys considerably stranger and considerably more deliberate than anything a single footprint alone could ever prove. A trail of objects, unlike a footprint, does not disappear with the next season's rain. Stone survives, and in a small cave overlooking the Aegean Sea on the coast of what is now Greece, archaeologists found stone that should not, by most conventional accounts of ancient human capability, have been there at all. The cave is called Franchtiti, and it has been excavated carefully layer by careful layer for decades, producing one of the longest continuous archaeological records anywhere in the Mediterranean region. Among the tools recovered from its oldest inhabited layers, researchers identified a material called obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass prized throughout prehistory for its ability to be worked into an extraordinarily sharp cutting edge, sharper in many cases than the finest steel blade produced today. Obsidian does not occur naturally anywhere near Franchthi. Chemical analysis using techniques capable of matching the precise trace elements in a piece of volcanic glass to its exact geological source traced the specific origin of this particular obsidian to the island of Melos, a piece of volcanic rock sitting in open water roughly 70 miles from the cave. Separated from the mainland by a stretch of the Aegean Sea, it has remained open water for the entire span of human history, even during the driest, coldest periods of the most recent ice age. The obsidian found at Franchthi has been dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, which means that whoever brought it back to that cave crossed a genuinely significant stretch of open sea deliberately, and did so early enough that the practice was apparently already well established rather than an isolated one-time event. This detail alone would be interesting enough on its own. What makes it part of a much larger, considerably more contested story is a different set of stone tools found not at Franchthi, but on the island of Crete itself, a much larger island sitting even further out in the Mediterranean one, that has never at any point in its geological history been connected to the mainland by dry land. Researchers working on Crete in the early years of this century uncovered a collection of hand axes and other stone tools bearing a strong resemblance to a much older tool-making tradition, one typically associated not with modern humans at all, but with far earlier human relatives, potentially stretching back well over 100,000 years, and by some interpretations considerably further than that. The tools themselves are not subtle or ambiguous in their basic shape. Anyone reasonably familiar with the broad sweep of stone tool development across human prehistory would recognize the general style immediately: a deliberately worked symmetrical hand axe, chipped carefully on both sides to form a functional cutting and chopping edge, a design that appears across enormous stretches of Africa, Europe and Asia for an extraordinarily long period of time, typically associated with hominins considerably older than modern Homo sapiens. Finding tools like these on an island that has never once, even at the height of Ice Age sea level, drops been reachable by dryland forces, a genuinely uncomfortable question onto researchers who might otherwise have preferred to keep the story of ancient seafaring neatly confined to a much more recent, much more comfortable timeline. This is where the field genuinely openly disagrees, and where the disagreement matters far more than it might first appear. If the Crete tools were made by modern humans arriving relatively recently, the discovery is interesting but not especially disruptive to the broader story most researchers already accept. If, however, the tools were made by an older human relative, something closer to an early Neanderthal ancestor, or even something resembling the same early form of Homo erectus, responsible for the mysterious crossings onto Flores that we explored earlier in this story, the implications become considerably larger. It would mean that hominins without fully modern cognitive abilities were successfully crossing open Mediterranean water on more than one occasion in more than one region of the world, hundreds of thousands of years before most researchers had previously believed anything resembling deliberate seafaring was possible. Similar debates on a smaller scale have emerged around other Mediterranean islands as well. Stone tools of a broadly comparable age and style have since been reported on Naxos in the Cyclades and on other scattered islands across the eastern Mediterranean. Each new discovery adding another small data point to an increasingly difficult pattern to dismiss as simple coincidence. Individually, any one of these sites might be explained away by a skeptical researcher as a fluke, a misdated layer, or a tool that migrated to its current location through some overlooked natural process, rather than deliberate human transport. Collectively, the growing number of similar finds across a wide geographic area has made that kind of dismissal considerably harder to sustain with confidence, even among researchers who remain personally cautious about fully embracing the intentionalist position. Scholars remain genuinely divided on how to interpret this evidence, and the division is not simply a matter of a few outlying opinions against an otherwise settled consensus. Respected researchers on one side of the debate argue that dating stone tools found on the surface rather than buried in a clearly stratified datable layer carries enormous uncertainty, and that a handful of surface finds, however tantalizing, cannot responsibly overturn decades of accumulated understanding about when and how seafaring technology first developed. Researchers on the other side counter that dismissing physical evidence simply because it complicates an existing timeline is precisely the kind of thinking that has throughout the history of archaeology repeatedly delayed the acceptance of discoveries that later proved entirely correct. Similar resistance, they point out, greeted the earliest suggestions that hominins had reached Flores at all, before the evidence eventually became too consistent and too widespread to reasonably dismiss. The evidence remains incomplete enough that neither side has been able to fully settle the question, and it is entirely possible that it will remain unsettled for years or even decades until new dating techniques or new discoveries eventually tip the balance more firmly in one direction. This kind of open, unresolved disagreement can feel unsatisfying to an audience used to history delivered as a tidy, finished story. It is worth pausing to appreciate why the discomfort is, in this case, actually a healthy sign rather than a weakness. A field in which every question has already been definitively answered is usually a field that has stopped genuinely investigating anything new. The ongoing argument over Crete, over Franchthi, over every scattered obsidian blade and disputed stone tool reflects a discipline still actively wrestling with real unresolved physical evidence, rather than one simply repeating comfortable settled conclusions passed down from an earlier generation of researchers who may not have had access to the same techniques or the same breadth of comparative sites available today. It helps in trying to understand a disagreement like this one, to appreciate just how differently the two broad camps within this field tend to approach the underlying question. Researchers who lean toward what is sometimes informally called the accidentalist position tend to emphasize how naturally explainable an isolated crossing can be. Storms, tsunamis, and sudden flooding events, all documented even in modern times, to sweep animals and debris considerable distances across open water without any deliberate intention at all. From this perspective, a single group of early hominins reaching an island like Crete does not necessarily require anything resembling planned seafaring. It only requires one sufficiently dramatic storm and enough surviving individuals swept along together to eventually establish a lasting population on the far shore. There is real geological support for at least the plausibility of this idea. The Eastern Mediterranean has a long documented history of powerful tsunamis generated by earthquakes along the same tectonic boundaries responsible for the region's frequent seismic activity. A tsunami capable of sweeping a section of coastal forest along with anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in it out into open water is not a purely theoretical scenario. It has happened within recorded human history, and there is no obvious reason it could not have happened, in some form considerably earlier as well, delivering an entire small group to a distant shore all at once rather than through the slower, more gradual process a deliberate migration might suggest. Researchers who lean toward what is sometimes called the intentionalist position generally find this explanation difficult to stretch across every documented case. They point out that establishing a genuinely viable breeding population on a new island through pure accident would likely require multiple separate successful crossings over time, not just one, since a single-stranded group faces very real risks of eventually dying out through simple bad luck disease, or an unbalanced ratio of men to women among the survivors. Repeated accidental success, this argument goes, starts to strain. Credulity after enough separate islands and enough separate time periods show the same basic pattern. At some point, according to this view, it becomes more reasonable to imagine that some early hominin populations had developed at least a rudimentary, repeatable method of crossing water on purpose, even if that method looked nothing like anything we would recognize today as a proper boat. Proponents of this second view often point to a separate related body of evidence that has grown considerably over the past few decades, controlled experiments in which researchers have built simple rafts using only tools and materials that would plausibly have been available to early hominins, then attempted to sail or paddle them across genuinely open stretches of water under realistic conditions. Some of these experimental crossings have succeeded, occasionally covering distances comparable to those separating certain Mediterranean islands from the mainland, offering a kind of practical proof that the basic physical feat, while difficult, was not necessarily beyond the capability of a resourceful, motivated group working with nothing more than fire-hardened wood plant fibre cordage and considerable patience. Neither camp within this debate is arguing carelessly, and it is worth resisting the temptation to imagine one side as simply more rigorous or more imaginative than the other. Both are working from the same limited, frustratingly incomplete physical evidence, and both are applying entirely reasonable scientific caution to a question that by its very nature may never be fully resolved with the kind of certainty either camp would prefer. What unites them more than what divides them is a shared recognition that something considerably stranger and more complicated happened across these ancient waters than the simple, tidy narrative of gradual, exclusively land-based human migration that many of us likely absorbed without much scrutiny from an early textbook or a half-remembered school lesson. There is a broader, quieter lesson buried inside this particular scholarly disagreement, one that extends well beyond the specific question of who first reached Crete or Melos or Flores. If a species without our own full range of cognitive tools, without written language, without anything resembling formal planning, as we understand it today, was nonetheless finding ways across open water on a regular enough basis to leave a genuine, repeated archaeological signature. What does that suggest about the actual boundary between instinct and intention in the deep human past? It is a question without a clean answer, and perhaps it is meant to stay that way for now. What does seem clear, looking across every piece of evidence gathered from Franchthi, from Crete, from Flores, and from every other scattered, contested site scholars continue to argue about today, is that water was never quite the absolute, unbreakable barrier it must have appeared to be to anyone standing at its edge in the deep past. It was instead something closer to a difficult, unpredictable door, one that occasionally unpredictably and for reasons we may never fully understand opened. There is something almost comforting in a strange way about how honestly this particular corner of archaeology admits its own limits. Popular retellings of ancient history often smooth over exactly this kind of uncertainty, presenting a single confident narrative, because a confident narrative is simpler to tell and easier to remember. The actual research looks considerably messier, full of competing interpretations, careful hedging, and researchers who have devoted entire careers to a question that may never receive a fully satisfying answer within their own lifetime. That messiness is not a flaw in how the story has been told you tonight. It is, if anything, a more honest reflection of how difficult it actually is to reconstruct decisions made by people who left behind nothing but scattered stone and the faint, indirect echo of where that stone eventually ended up. It is worth remembering, amid all this careful, scholarly disagreement, that every single crossing being debated here, whether accidental or deliberate, whether made by modern humans or by an older, more distant relative, still began and ended with real individual people. Behind every contested obsidian blade and every disputed stone tool sits a person who stood at the edge of open water, made some version of a decision, and either returned home or did not. The scholars arguing today over how to interpret that decision are not merely debating abstract dates and categories. They are trying carefully and honestly to reconstruct the actual choices of people who left behind almost nothing to explain themselves, and who could never have imagined that their small private decision at the edge of the sea would still be argued over this many thousands of years later. For the communities left behind on the mainland watching a small group depart and never return, and for the communities eventually established somewhere entirely new, this scholarly uncertainty would have meant nothing at all. What mattered to them was considerably more immediate and considerably more human. The slow, quiet process of becoming something separate, something increasingly distinct from the people they had left behind. Whether that separation happened by accident, by choice, or by some combination of both that no single word could ever fully capture. Somewhere in the world today, two villages sit within easy walking distance of each other, along the banks of a single river close enough that a person in one can sometimes hear voices carried across the water from the other. And yet if someone from the first village were to walk over and try to speak with someone from the second, they would understand almost nothing at all, not a greeting, not a request for food, not even the simplest words for water or family. This is not a hypothetical scenario, invented to illustrate a point. It is an ordinary documented reality along the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea, one of the most linguistically fragmented regions found anywhere on the surface of the Earth. Papua New Guinea, taken as a whole, is home to more than 800 distinct languages, spoken across a population smaller than that of many single cities elsewhere in the world. Linguists studying the region have long puzzled over why such an extraordinary concentration of separate, often mutually unintelligible languages developed in such a comparatively small geographic area, when much larger nations elsewhere in the world get by with only a handful. To put the scale of this in perspective, roughly 1 out of every 12 languages currently spoken anywhere on Earth belongs to a country that occupies less than 1% of the planet's total land area. The most widely accepted explanation points again and again to the region's fractured, difficult terrain, dense mountain ranges, thick rainforest, and above all an intricate network of rivers that has spent thousands of years quietly, persistently keeping neighbouring communities from ever fully blending into one another. The Sepik River in particular has become something of a case study for linguists interested in exactly this phenomenon. Communities living along its winding course and along the many smaller tributaries that feed into it have developed languages so distinct from their immediate neighbours that some researchers have described the river's basin as containing more linguistic diversity packed into a smaller area than almost anywhere else studied on Earth. Villages separated by only a few miles of water and forest can belong to entirely unrelated language families. Families with no clearer common ancestry between them than English shares with a language spoken on the opposite side of the planet. Fieldworkers who have spent extended time along the Sepik often describe a genuinely striking pattern once they begin travelling upstream or downstream by canoe, stopping in one village after another. Within the space of a single day's travel, the language spoken at each stop can shift entirely, sometimes multiple times, with local guides required simply to move between communities that on a map appear to be practically neighbours. Older residents in many of these villages can often speak 2, 3 or even 4 separate neighbouring languages learned not from any formal schooling, but from a lifetime of trade contact, intermarriage and necessity, while younger generations, increasingly influenced by a shared regional trade language, used more broadly across the country, sometimes retain considerably less of that same multilingual fluency changed linguists are actively documenting even now, aware that some of the smaller languages along the river may not survive another generation or two. What produces this kind of extreme divergence in such a relatively short amount of time and distance is a process linguists sometimes describe using a term borrowed from evolutionary biology, the founder effect. When a small group of people becomes isolated from a larger population, whatever particular quirks, habits and variations already existed within that small group, quirks that would ordinarily be smoothed out through constant contact and exchange with a much larger community, instead become fixed and amplified within the isolated group over time. A slightly unusual way of pronouncing a particular sound, a locally invented word for a plant or tool found only in that specific stretch of riverbank, an idiosyncratic grammatical shortcut that one influential speaker happened to favour all of these small, essentially random variations, can given enough generations of isolation snowball into something as dramatic as an entirely separate, mutually incomprehensible language. It helps to picture how this might unfold across a handful of generations within a single small community. A respected elder, perhaps simply through personal habit, begins consistently shortening a particular common phrase, dropping a syllable that everyone else in the wider region still pronounces in full. Children raised listening to that elder absorb the shortened version as entirely normal, unaware that anything has changed at all. A generation or two later, the shortened form has become the only version anyone in that particular village has ever known, while neighbouring communities, never having heard the elder's original habit, continue using the fuller form unchanged. Multiply this single small drift by hundreds of similar, entirely independent variations accumulating simultaneously across vocabulary. Grammar and pronunciation repeated across dozens of generations in each isolated pocket, and something that began as a single shared language can plausibly fracture into something resembling 2, 3, or considerably more distinct ways of speaking, understood clearly within each small community and almost entirely opaque to every neighbouring one. This same basic mechanism, operating on culture and tool-making rather than language specifically, almost certainly shape the deep prehistoric world we've spent so much of this story exploring. We discussed earlier, how small differences in stone tool style could emerge between populations separated by river differences visible today in the archaeological record. Language would have been subject to exactly the same forces, and likely diverge considerably faster, since spoken words shift and drift within a single generation in ways that a physical tool tradition passed down through careful direct instruction generally does not. Scholars still debate how much of modern linguistic diversity in fragmented landscapes like Papua New Guinea can be responsibly mapped directly onto the deep prehistoric past. Since the two situations, however, similar in underlying mechanism, developed across very different time scales and under very different broader conditions. The evidence remains incomplete about precisely how quickly prehistoric river-divided populations would have drifted apart linguistically, since spoken language, unlike stone, leaves absolutely no direct trace in the archaeological record, but the logic connecting cause and effect is difficult to avoid. If a river narrow enough to be crossed with real effort could produce the kind of linguistic fragmentation documented today along the Sepik, it becomes considerably easier to imagine how the much wider, much more consistently dangerous rivers of deep prehistory might have shaped an equally fragmented, equally diverse tapestry of separate early human languages and beliefs, most of which have left behind no trace whatsoever for us to ever recover. What would it have meant practically to live inside a world fragmented this way, where the people just across a river spoke, believed, and understood the world in ways genuinely foreign to your own? For some communities, that difference likely hardened into caution or outright hostility. The unfamiliar voices on the far bank treated less as fellow humans and more as something closer to strangers in the fullest, most unsettling sense of the word. People whose intentions could not be easily read or trusted because their very language offered no shared foundation to build understanding from. Anthropologists studying more recent still-living examples of exactly this kind of fragmented riverine society have documented both possibilities playing out side by side, sometimes even between the very same pair of neighbouring communities across different periods of their shared history. Deep suspicion and periodic conflict existed alongside carefully maintained trade relationships, intermarriage arrangements, and shared ceremonial gatherings, held at agreed neutral points along the water. Evidence that isolation, even severe isolation, rarely meant total and permanent separation. Belief systems appear to have fragmented alongside language following a strikingly similar pattern of drift. Neighbouring communities separated by the same river might develop entirely different explanations for the same natural phenomenon, a particular star pattern, an unusual rock formation, the reason a specific bend in the river occasionally claimed lives. One village's sacred story about the origin of a nearby waterfall might bear no resemblance whatsoever to the story told by a community living only a short distance upstream, despite both communities almost certainly having descended many generations earlier from the very same shared ancestral group. Anthropologists studying oral tradition in fragmented river societies note that these divergent belief systems tend to develop their own internal logic and consistency remarkably quickly, each one becoming within a few generations every bit as coherent and deeply held as the shared tradition it had originally split from. Market days and trade gatherings held at river crossings appear in fact to be one of the oldest and most consistent human solutions to exactly this problem. A practical, carefully negotiated exception carved into an otherwise formidable barrier. Communities that could not easily understand each other's spoken language nonetheless found ways to establish trade, often relying on gesture, a small shared vocabulary of essential trade terms, or the quiet, universal language of demonstrated goods laid out for inspection. A particular stretch of riverbank might become known across generations as a place where hostility was deliberately set aside, where the ordinary rules of suspicion between separated groups were temporarily relaxed in service of exchanging something. Genuinely needed salt obsidian particular tools, or simply news of what lay further along the river in either direction. Anthropologists have documented remarkably sophisticated versions of exactly this arrangement among more recent river and trading networks, including elaborate systems in which specific individuals, often called trade partners, maintained personal inherited relationships with the designated counterpart from a neighboring, linguistically unrelated community, relationships passed down from parent to child across generations, each side responsible for extending hospitality, safe passage, and honest dealing to the other whenever a crossing was made. These trade partnerships often carried genuine ceremonial weight, marked by an exchange of small personal gifts alongside whatever primary goods were being traded, a way of reaffirming on each visit that the relationship itself mattered every bit as much as the material exchange it enabled. There is no reason to assume arrangements like these are a purely modern invention, given how consistently similar structures appear across entirely unrelated, geographically distant riverine societies studied by anthropologists. Many researchers suspect that some version of this same basic solution, individuals or small groups serving as trusted bridges across an otherwise impassable linguistic and cultural divide, likely stretches back considerably further into prehistory than any written or oral record could ever directly confirm. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that trade of this kind required real sustained trust, built and carefully maintained across a divide that language itself could not bridge. A community agreeing to meet strangers from the far bank year after year at the same particular bend in the river was making a quiet, ongoing bet that the arrangement would continue to hold, that today's meeting would not turn into an ambush, that the goods offered would be honest, that the fragile peace negotiated by a previous generation would carry forward into this one. Scholars still debate how far back in prehistory this kind of structured cross-river trade genuinely extends, since the physical evidence, scattered trade goods found far from their point of origin, can rarely tell us with certainty whether they arrive through peaceful exchange, through more forceful means, or through some complicated combination of both across many intermediate hands. What does seem reasonably clear is that human beings, even under conditions of genuine linguistic and cultural fragmentation, have almost always found some narrow, carefully negotiated channel for connection to survive, alongside the much wider channel of separation. Genetic research on modern populations living in similarly fragmented river and highland regions offers one more layer to this picture. A layer written not in language or stone tools, but directly in the human body itself. Studies of populations across the highlands and river valleys of Papua New Guinea have found measurable genetic differences between neighboring groups separated by surprisingly short distances, differences considerably larger than researchers typically find between populations spread across far greater distances in more open, easily traversed landscapes elsewhere in the world. The pattern mirrors almost precisely what we discussed earlier regarding the Congo River and its effect on chimpanzee and bonobo populations, except here, the populations being separated and slowly diverging are entirely human living within a single human lifetime of one another, and yet carrying measurably different genetic signatures shaped by generations of limited contact across the same rivers and mountains that also shape their languages. Researchers conducting this kind of genetic survey often describe a particular kind of humility that comes with the work and awareness that the numbers on a page, however precise, represent something considerably more intimate than an abstract statistic. Each measurable genetic difference reflects an accumulated history of individual decisions, who married whom, which communities maintained enough contact to occasionally exchange partners across a difficult river crossing, and which communities, for whatever combination of practical or cultural reasons, largely did not. A river that seems from a distance like a simple geographic feature turns out on closer study to have quietly shaped the most intimate and personal choices available to thousands of individual people across countless separate generations, choices about who to trust, who to court, and where ultimately to build a life. It is tempting, looking at fragmentation this extreme, to imagine deep prehistoric humanity as an enormous scattering of small, mutually unintelligible, largely isolated pockets, each one developing in near total independence from every other. The reality was almost certainly more complicated, and in its own way more remarkable than that. Isolation and connection existed simultaneously in constant tension, a river dividing two groups linguistically and culturally, while a carefully negotiated crossing point maintained across generations kept some thread of contact quietly alive between them. Neither force ever fully won out over the other for very long. Rivers kept dividing, and people kept finding narrow, hard-won ways to reach across the divide anyway, an uneasy, remarkably persistent balance that shaped the deep human story every bit as much as any single migration or any single dramatic crossing ever could. That same tension between division and connection would eventually find its resolution in something entirely new, a shift away from waiting for luck or accident to carry someone across and towards something people began to build for themselves on purpose. There is a difference between what a river allows and what a tool allows, and for most of human history that difference did not exist at all. A person crossed only where the water happened to permit it on the log that happened to be floating past on the day the current happened to be gentle enough. Then at some point difficult to pin down with total precision, that arrangement quietly reversed itself. People stopped waiting for water to grant permission and started deciding, on their own terms, when and where a crossing would happen. The oldest known boat in the world was found not in a warm tropical river system, the kind of setting we have spent most of this story exploring, but in a peat bog in the Netherlands, in a village called Pesse. In the middle of the 20th century, workers carrying out routine excavation for a new road uncovered a long, hollowed log buried deep in the waterlogged soil, remarkably well preserved by the same low oxygen, highly acidic bog conditions that have famously preserved human bodies in similar northern European wetlands for thousands of years. When researchers eventually dated the wood using radiocarbon analysis, the results startled them. The boat was somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years old, considerably older than researchers at the time had expected any deliberately constructed watercraft to be. The canoe itself is modest by almost any standard, barely long enough for a single adult to lie down inside, and narrow enough that using it would have required real balance and considerable care. It shows clear evidence of repair, as well patched and reinforced at least once during its working life, a small but telling detail suggesting the boat was genuinely used repeatedly by someone who valued it enough to fix, rather than simply discard it once damage appeared. Today, the original Pesce canoe rests carefully preserved in a museum in the Netherlands, still capable after all these thousands of years of prompting the same basic reaction in almost everyone who sees it up close. A quiet, genuine surprise that something built this early could look this deliberately recognizably like a boat. What makes the Pesce canoe so significant is not simply its age, but what it reveals about the mind of the person who made it. This was not a log that someone happened to grab during a flood. The wood had been deliberately shaped, hollowed out along its length using a combination of controlled fire and careful scraping its ends, tapered into a form clearly intended to move more efficiently through water than a simple unmodified log ever could. Producing a boat like this required real planning, selecting the correct type of tree, controlling a fire precisely enough to burn away wood without destroying the entire log, and investing what was very likely several full days of sustained effort into an object that would only prove useful once it was actually finished. This is a genuinely different category of behavior from clinging to whatever happened to be floating past during an emergency. It represents someone imagining a future crossing one that had not happened yet, and building the tool to make that future crossing possible on their own terms. Techniques for hollowing a log using fire broadly similar to whatever process the maker of the Pesce canoe likely used have persisted in various forms across an enormous range of cultures and time periods, a testament to how effective and how relatively simple the underlying method actually is. A carefully controlled fire is set along the top of a selected log, burning downward into the wood in a controlled channel. Before the fire can burn completely through or spread beyond the intended area, it is doused and the charred wood, softened and weakened by the burning, is scraped away using a stone tool or a similarly hard implement. The process is then repeated, fire followed by scraping followed by more fire, gradually deepening and widening the hollow with each cycle, until enough material has been removed to leave a functional buoyant hull. Anthropologists studying communities that continued using this same basic dugout canoe technique into the modern era describe it as slow, physically demanding, and requiring a level of patience that a single rushed attempt could easily ruin, since burning even slightly too aggressively in one spot risked weakening the hull to the point of failure. The dugout canoe was far from the only solution early people developed for crossing water on their own terms, and in certain parts of the world an entirely different material offered an equally effective and in some ways considerably more accessible alternative. Along the marshy edges of ancient Mesopotamia, where dense reed beds grew abundantly along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, communities developed a tradition of building boats not from solid wood, difficult to find and difficult to shape in a landscape often short on large trees, but from bundles of reeds gathered, dried and tightly bound together into a buoyant, remarkably seaworthy hull. Reed itself, hollow and lightweight, traps a considerable amount of air within its structure, giving a properly constructed reed bundle enough natural buoyancy to support real weight, provided the reeds were harvested and dried, using techniques passed down carefully across generations to prevent premature waterlogging. The reed boat tradition of ancient Mesopotamia proved remarkably durable both as a practical technology and as an idea worth testing directly. In the later years of the 20th century, the Norwegian explorer and researcher Thor Heyerdahl became fascinated by the question of whether ancient reed boats built using only the tools and materials genuinely available to ancient builders could plausibly have crossed genuinely significant stretches of open ocean rather than simply navigating calm, sheltered rivers and marshes. Heyerdahl commissioned traditional reed boat builders to construct a vessel named Re, using construction techniques modelled directly on ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian designs, and then attempted to sail it across the Atlantic Ocean. The first attempt in the year 1969 ultimately failed, partway across the boat gradually taking on water and losing structural integrity before the crew was forced to abandon it. rather than treating this as a final answer. Heyerdahl and his team studied exactly what had gone wrong, adjusted the construction technique, and attempted the crossing again the following year, this time completing the full Atlantic crossing successfully. The experiment did not prove that ancient people definitely made this exact journey. What it did prove convincingly is that the underlying technology itself, reed boats built using materials and methods plausibly available thousands of years ago, was genuinely capable of surviving open ocean conditions, removing one of the more common objections researchers had previously raised against the idea of deliberate long-distance ancient seafaring. The failure of the first attempt turned out to be nearly as valuable scientifically as the eventual success of the second. Heyerdahl and his crew determined that the original construction had used a rope binding technique subtly different from the traditional method still practiced by the reed boat builders they had originally consulted. A shortcut introduced during the actual building process that gradually allowed the reed bundles to sag and separate under the constant strain of ocean swells. Correcting that one specific technical detail, returning more faithfully to the traditional binding method, was enough to transform a boat that failed within weeks into one capable of completing an entire ocean crossing. It is a small, humbling reminder of how much precise, hard-won knowledge could be embedded in a tradition passed down across generations, knowledge easy to underestimate or accidentally lose, even when following what looks on the surface like the same basic method. A third major tradition developed in regions where neither large timber for dugout canoes nor abundant reed beds were readily available, particularly across the colder, more resource-scarce landscapes of the far north. Communities in these regions turned instead to animal skin stretching, carefully prepared hides over a lightweight wooden or bone frame to create boats that were in their own way every bit as sophisticated as anything built from wood or reed. Skin boats of this kind, still built and used today by certain Arctic communities under names like the umiak and the kayak, offered a genuinely different set of advantages compared to a heavy dugout canoe. A properly constructed skin boat could be remarkably light, easily carried by a small group over the land between one body of water and another, and remarkably resilient against the kind of ice and cold that would eventually rot or crack a wooden hull. Building one required an entirely different, equally demanding set of specialized knowledge understanding exactly how to prepare and stretch a hide so that it remained watertight without becoming brittle, understanding which animal skins offered the best combination of strength and flexibility, and understanding how to construct a frame light enough to carry but sturdy enough to survive genuinely dangerous open water. The kayak in particular developed into something remarkably specialized over many generations of refinement, evolving from a general-purpose small craft into a tool precisely suited to a single demanding task: hunting sea mammals alone in open, frequently dangerous water. A well-built kayak could be sealed almost completely around its occupant, using a waterproof garment lashed tightly to the boat's opening, allowing the craft to roll completely upside down in rough water and right itself again without swamping a maneuver that took considerable skill to execute reliably, but that transformed an otherwise fragile-looking vessel into something genuinely capable of surviving conditions that would easily overturn and sink a less carefully engineered boat. The umiak, by contrast, developed along a different path, entirely built larger and more open, designed to carry an entire extended family, along with their belongings during seasonal migrations, a communal vessel rather than a single hunter's specialized tool. Its construction and maintenance, often understood as women's particular area of expertise within many traditional Arctic communities, a detail that quietly complicates any assumption that early boat-building knowledge belonged exclusively to men. What unites these three very different solutions, the hollowed log, the bundled reed hull, and the stretched skin frame is not any shared material or shared technique, but a shared underlying shift in how people related to water in the first place. Each of these technologies required its makers to think ahead to gather specific materials well before they were actually needed to invest real time and effort into an object that would only pay off once it was finished, and to trust ultimately that the finished object would actually work when the moment came to depend on it. This represents the genuinely different relationship with risk than anything we have discussed earlier in this story. A person clinging to a floating log during a flood was responding to danger already upon them. A person spending several days deliberately hollowing a canoe or carefully stretching and drying a hide was preparing for a danger that had not yet arrived, betting real time and a real effort against a future crossing that might not even happen for weeks or months. Scholars still debate which of these major technologies developed first and in which particular region of the world, since organic materials like wood, reed and hide decay far more readily than stone, leaving archaeologists with a frustratingly incomplete picture assembled from a small number of exceptionally lucky preservation events like the specific bog conditions that happened to save the Pessie canoe for us to eventually find. It is entirely possible and considered likely by many researchers that several different communities in several different parts of the world arrived at broadly similar solutions independently, each responding to the specific materials available in their own particular landscape rather than learning the idea from any single point of original invention. The evidence remains incomplete enough that a definitive single point of origin for deliberate boat building may never be identified with full confidence, and perhaps that uncertainty itself tells us something important, that the underlying human drive to master water on its own terms was widespread and persistent enough to be discovered again and again independently, wherever people found themselves genuinely needing it. What would it have meant within a small early community to be the person who held this particular knowledge? Unlike a skill every adult in a group might reasonably be expected to learn boat building of any real sophistication likely required, focused practice, patient trial and error, and a willingness to fail multiple times before producing something genuinely seaworthy. It is reasonable to imagine that certain individuals within a community gradually became recognized specialists in this particular craft, their knowledge valuable enough to be carefully protected and deliberately passed down, likely to a chosen apprentice rather than freely shared with everyone in the group. A community fortunate enough to have such a person in its ranks gained something genuinely valuable, a reliable, repeatable way to reach the far side of a river or a stretch of coastline that had previously been reachable only through luck, desperation, or considerable danger. A community without anyone holding this knowledge remained in a very real sense at the mercy of the same random, unpredictable forces that had shaped human movement for the entire span of prehistory up to that point. A skilled boat builder. Once a community came to depend on their particular expertise, would likely have occupied a genuinely unusual social position, valued not for strength or speed, the way a skilled hunter might be, but for a slower, more deliberate kind of competence, patience translated directly into survival. It is easy to imagine such a person becoming something close to indispensable, consulted before any significant crossing entrusted with the community's most valuable timber or hides, their judgment about which materials to use and which crossings were safe carrying real weight in decisions that affected the entire group. Whether that specialized status also carried any particular social recognition, a title, a place of honor at gatherings, a share of food, set aside in thanks, is something the archaeological record can rarely confirm with any confidence. But the underlying logic of specialization and the value a community places on genuinely rare, genuinely difficult expertise has proven remarkably consistent across human societies studied throughout history, and there is little reason to think the earliest boat builders were treated any differently. There is something worth sitting with in how quietly this shift likely happened without any single dramatic moment marking its arrival. No community woke up one morning having invented the boat. The process almost certainly unfolded, gradually one modest improvement layered onto another, across many generations. A slightly better way to bind a reed bundle here. A slightly more efficient fire hollowing technique there. Small refinements accumulating slowly until, at some point impossible to pinpoint precisely the accumulated knowledge, crossed an invisible threshold from occasional improvised survival technique into genuine, reliable technology. The moment that threshold was crossed would not have felt like a single celebrated breakthrough to the people living through it. It would simply have felt like their boats were getting a little better year after year, generation after generation, until crossing water that had once meant almost certain danger became instead something closer to routine. It is worth imagining for a moment what it might have felt like to be a child growing up during exactly this transitional period. Watching the older generation's caution around water slowly gradually relax as the family's boats became more reliable year after year. Where an earlier generation might have approached any river crossing with genuine dread, this same family, a generation or two later, might have approached the identical stretch of water with something closer to ordinary. Practical confidence, the accumulated fear of countless earlier drownings, gradually loosening its grip, not because the river itself had become any less dangerous, but because the tools available for meeting that danger had finally quietly caught up to it. That shift, subtle and largely unrecorded as it must have been, represents one of the more genuinely hopeful turns in this entire story. A moment when human ingenuity, patiently accumulated across countless unremembered generations, finally began to outpace one of the oldest and most persistent threats our species had ever faced. And once that threshold had been crossed, once a community could reliably move people, goods and knowledge across water on its own terms, rather than waiting for water to occasionally, unpredictably allow it, an entirely new kind of relationship with rivers became possible. One built not around fear and careful avoidance, but around something considerably closer to genuine partnership. By the time reliable boats existed in enough places, in enough hands, across enough generations, something remarkable had quietly become possible that had never truly been an option before. A community no longer needed to avoid a river or fear it or treat it purely as a threat to be endured. It could instead choose to live directly beside one, permanently confident that the water in front of it was now a resource to be used on command rather than a danger to be survived by luck. This single shift, easy to understate given how gradual and undramatic it must have felt to the people living through it, turns out to explain an enormous amount of where human civilization eventually chose to root itself. The great early centers of settled human life, the ones many of us likely remember from a distant school lesson cluster, overwhelmingly along major rivers, not by coincidence, but because a mastered river offers an almost unbeatable combination of advantages once the fear of crossing it has been genuinely resolved. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers cradled the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. The Nile carried Egypt's civilization along its banks for thousands of uninterrupted years. The Indus River supported an early urban culture whose written language remains even now only partially understood by modern researchers. The Yellow River in China nurtured a civilization that has in one continuous form or another persisted longer than almost any other on Earth. In every one of these cases, the river was not simply nearby, it was the entire organizing logic of the civilization built around it, providing water for drinking and irrigation fertile soil, renewed by seasonal flooding, a highway for trade and communication, and once boats and crossing techniques had matured sufficiently safe, reliable access to both banks at once rather than just one. It is worth appreciating just how much a river offered once it stopped being purely an obstacle, A city built along a single riverbank, unable to reliably use the far side, effectively worked with only half the land, half the resources, and half the potential population available to it. A city that had mastered crossing could farm both banks, defend both banks, and draw on the combined resources of an entire river valley, rather than a single fragile strip beside it. Trade goods could move freely in both directions, rather than accumulating on one side only. Marriages, alliances, and shared religious practice could bind an entire river valley together into something functioning much closer to a single society than two separate, uneasily coexisting halves. The earliest great civilizations were not simply built near rivers, they were built by people who had finally learned to use an entire river, both banks and everything flowing between them, as one continuous unified resource. The Nile offers a particularly striking example of exactly how thoroughly a mastered river could reshape an entire civilization's daily rhythm and worldview. Ancient Egyptians developed a genuinely sophisticated understanding of the river's seasonal flooding pattern, tracking it using structures called nilometers, carefully marked stone or masonry installations built directly into the riverbank or into specially constructed wells connected to the river, allowing officials to measure the rising water level with real precision each year. This was not simply idle curiosity. The height of that year's flood directly predicted the richness of the coming harvest and, by extension, the tax revenue the state could expect to collect, making the nilometer one of the ancient world's earliest and most consequential instruments of practical applied measurement, a tool sitting at the exact intersection of religion, agriculture, and government administration. Some of these nilometer installations were genuinely elaborate structures, staircases descending directly into the riverbed, marked at precise intervals, so that a trained official could simply walk down and read the water level the way a modern person might check a thermometer. Records of these annual readings, where they survive, offer researchers today an extraordinary window into thousands of years of continuous Nile flooding history, allowing scientists to reconstruct climate patterns and agricultural conditions across an almost unbroken span of ancient Egyptian civilization. A measurement taken by a nervous young official 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, anxious about correctly reporting a number that would shape an entire year's taxation and food distribution, still tells us something subtle and precise about the world he lived. In an unusually direct thread connecting his particular, forgotten workday to our own modern understanding of ancient climate history. What makes this detail particularly worth pausing on is how directly it traces back to everything we have discussed throughout this story. A civilization capable of building and reading a nilometer, of predicting a flood's severity months in advance, and planning an entire year's agricultural and economic strategy around that prediction, represents an almost complete inversion of the relationship early humans once had with rivers. Where the earliest people we discussed could only watch a river rise and hope to survive it, ancient Egyptian officials could measure that same rise, understand its meaning, and use it to plan confidently for an entire nation's future. The fear had not disappeared entirely. Floods could still be catastrophic when they exceeded expectations, but it had been transformed through generations of accumulated observation and technical skill into something considerably closer to genuine partnership. And yet, even as rivers became the literal foundation of settled civilization, the old fear never fully vanished. It simply changed shape, migrating out of daily practical survival and into something more symbolic, more deeply embedded in belief and story rather than immediate physical danger. Across an extraordinary range of unrelated cultures separated by vast distances and by thousands of years, a strikingly similar image recurs again and again, a river that must be crossed not by the living, moving from one bank to another, but by the dead moving from this world into whatever comes after it. In ancient Greek tradition, the dead were believed to cross the river Styx, guided across by a ferryman named Charon, who required payment traditionally, a coin placed with the body during burial before he would agree to carry a soul to the far shore. Refusal or inability to pay according to this same tradition left a soul stranded, wandering the near bank, indefinitely unable to complete the journey and unable to return to the world of the living either. In ancient Egyptian belief, the deceased undertook their own significant journey, westward often understood in relation to crossing the Nile itself toward the setting sun and the realm of the dead that lay beyond it. In Hindu tradition, a river called the Vaitana is described in certain texts as a boundary the soul must cross after death, its character and difficulty shaped directly by the moral weight of the life the soul had just finished living. Versions of this same basic image appear well beyond these three, especially well-documented examples. Certain traditions among the Norse peoples of medieval Scandinavia describe a river called Gjoll, marking the boundary of the underworld, crossed by way of a bridge guarded by a watchful figure rather than a boat, a variation on the same underlying theme of water separating the living from the dead. Among various communities across sub-Saharan Africa, and among certain indigenous peoples of North America, researchers studying comparative mythology have documented water crossings of broadly similar symbolic weight built into local understandings of death and the journey beyond it, each tradition developing its own specific details, its own particular guardian or obstacle, while returning again and again to the same essential structure, a river standing between the world we know and whatever comes next. Scholars still debate exactly why this particular image, a river separating the world of the living from whatever lies beyond death, appears so consistently across cultures with no clear direct historical contact with one another. Some researchers favor an explanation rooted in shared human psychology rather than cultural transmission. The argument being that death itself as a genuinely unknowable transition from one state of existence into another naturally lends itself to being imagined through the most universally understood experience of transition available to ancient people, the physical act of crossing dangerous water from a known shore to an unknown one. Other researchers point instead to the possibility of much older, deeper cultural connections than currently traceable ideas that may have spread, however faintly and indirectly, along ancient trade routes and migration paths long before any of these specific mythological traditions took their eventually recorded familiar form. The evidence remains incomplete enough that neither explanation can be fully confirmed or ruled out, and it is entirely possible that both forces shared human psychology and faint ancient cultural contact contributed something to how consistently this particular image took root across such a wide span of the ancient world. Is it truly so surprising, though, that the last crossing a person was imagined to make also involved a river? For nearly the entire span of human prehistory that we have spent this story exploring a river, genuinely was one of the most significant, most consequential boundaries a person could ever face, capable of separating them permanently from everyone and everything they had ever known. Sometimes through drowning, sometimes through accidental exile onto a distant, unfamiliar shore, sometimes simply through the slow, patient work of geographic isolation across countless generations. Death, in its own way, offered exactly the same essential shape, a boundary that could not be seen through in advance, that separated the traveller completely and permanently from the world they had left behind, and that seemed to require in the imagination of nearly every culture that ever tried to picture it some kind of crossing to be completed before arrival on the other side. The ferryman figure, appearing in one recognizable form or another across so many unrelated mythological traditions, deserves particular attention in this light. A ferryman is not simply a boat operator. He represents in nearly every version of the myth someone who has mastered the exact skill this entire story has spent so much time exploring: safe, reliable passage across water that an ordinary traveller could never hope to cross alone. It is difficult not to see, in the enduring popularity of this particular mythological figure, an echo of the very real, very valued boat builders and river guides we discussed earlier. people whose hard-won expertise once meant the difference between a community's isolation and its connection to the wider world. The ferryman of myth carries souls. The ferryman of ordinary daily life in countless real ancient riverside communities carried grain, carried news, carried entire families reuniting after a difficult, dangerous separation. It should perhaps not surprise us that a role this valuable in life found its way in nearly identical form into how so many different cultures chose to imagine the final unavoidable journey everyone eventually makes. There is something quietly moving in imagining how a real living ferryman, someone a riverside community depended on for decades, might have shaped the way that same community eventually pictured death itself. A person who had spent an entire working life safely guiding others across dangerous water, who understood its moods and its dangers better than almost anyone else in the community, who had perhaps saved lives during sudden floods and calmly navigated crossings. Other people found too frightening to attempt alone would have earned a particular kind of trust difficult to replicate in any other role. When that same community eventually needed a way to imagine an unknown, unknowable final journey, it makes a certain intuitive sense that they might reach first for the one figure among them who had already proven again and again, across an entire lifetime of ordinary river crossings, that safe passage through genuine danger was possible after all. Rivers having once divided the earliest human populations and then later having demanded real courage and real ingenuity to finally master became something considerably richer than either a simple barrier or a simple resource. By the time settled civilization fully took hold, they became sacred. Nearly every major early civilization built along a significant river developed some form of ritual ceremony or organized religious practice directly tied to that specific waterway, treating it not merely as a geographic feature but as something closer to a living presence deserving of genuine respect, gratitude, and occasionally careful appeasement. The Nile was closely associated with the god Hapi, credited with bringing the annual flood that made Egyptian agriculture possible at all. The Ganges in the Indian subcontinent developed into one of the most sacred rivers in the entire Hindu tradition, its waters considered capable of purification in ways ordinary water could never achieve, a belief that has persisted essentially unbroken for thousands of years and remains genuinely significant to hundreds of millions of people practicing that tradition today. Reverence like this rarely emerged from pure abstraction. It grew generation after generation out of genuine dependence, out of a community's accumulated understanding that its own survival was tied intimately and completely to a force considerably larger and older than itself, one capable of tremendous generosity in a good year and tremendous devastation in a bad one. A farmer standing beside the Nile at planting season, watching the water level with the same careful attention his grandfather and great-grandfather had once given, it was participating in a relationship stretching back in one form or another to the earliest people who ever settled that same stretch of riverbank. A relationship built from equal parts gratitude, dependence, and the quiet carried forward memory of every flood and every drought that had ever tested the community's endurance. Religious ceremony in this light was not merely superstition layered on top of practical agricultural knowledge. It was in a very real sense the accumulated emotional memory of an entire civilization's relationship with the single force that had made its existence possible in the first place, given shape and structure through story, ritual, and shared belief passed carefully from one generation to the next. There is a certain quiet symmetry worth noticing in how completely the human relationship with rivers had transformed by this point in the story. We began many parts ago with a woman standing at a river's edge entirely at the mercy of water. She could not predict, could not control, and could not safely cross without real risk to her own life and the life of her child. We arrive now at civilizations that had learned to measure that same river's rise with precision, to cross it reliably whenever necessary, to build their entire economic and agricultural calendar around its seasonal rhythm, and in the deepest, most enduring layer of all, to worship it, to thank it, and to imagine it as sacred enough to accompany the human soul itself on its final journey out of this world. None of this erased the danger entirely, of course. Rivers continued to flood unpredictably, continued to drown the careless or the unlucky, continued to shift course and reshape the very landscapes people had built their lives around. But the fundamental relationship had changed permanently and irreversibly from one of pure vulnerability into one of complicated, hard-won partnership. Danger and dependence and reverence all layered together into something no single word could ever fully capture. It is a relationship that in one form or another, every one of us still lives inside today, whether we notice it or not. Every time we cross a bridge without a second thought, every time we turn on a tap, without wondering where the water actually came from. Every time we glance at a river from a car window and see nothing more than scenery rather than the ancient, patient force that once decided entirely on its own terms who got to live and who did not. That long, quiet transformation from absolute barrier to sacred, trusted partner brings this particular story very close to its own final crossing, the point where everything we have explored together tonight finally settles into something worth carrying with you as you drift the rest of the way into sleep. We began this story with a single woman standing at the edge of moving water, her daughter's hand in hers, trying to decide whether the ground on the far side was worth the danger in between. It is worth returning to her now briefly because everything this story has explored since then has in one way or another been an answer to the question she was quietly asking herself that day. For most of human history, that question had no reliable answer at all. A river divided populations before anyone understood what a population was, splitting a single people into separate stories that would drift apart in language, in belief, in the shape of their tools and the sound of their voices, until neighbours within earshot of one another became for all practical purposes strangers, the way we heard happen along the Sepik, where villages within sight of each other still cannot understand a single word the other speaks. A river drowned the careless and the unlucky in equal measure, took children from their parents' hands in a matter of seconds and asked nothing in return beyond the ordinary indifference of moving water that has never once in the entire history of this planet cared who it swept away. Crocodiles waited beneath its surface with a patience no human hunter could ever match, patient enough to leave their mark quite literally in the bones of an ancient foot found at Olduvai Gorge. Hippos turned a moment of simple bad luck into tragedy. Flash floods arrived from storms that had already finished falling somewhere else entirely out of sight, out of warning, days before the water itself finally showed up. For an almost unimaginable span of time, being human meant living beside something that could give you everything you needed to survive and take everything you had within the same single afternoon. And yet the story did not end there, because it never does. Somewhere among the countless families who stood exactly where that first woman stood, weighing the same impossible choice, a small number began finding their way across anyway, sometimes by accident, clinging to a log that happened to float, swept by a current that happened against every reasonable expectation to deliver them somewhere survivable rather than somewhere fatal. On islands separated by water that should have made them permanently unreachable, evidence suggests some of our most distant relatives, hominins, without anything resembling our own full range of thought and planning, nonetheless found their way across again and again, leaving behind small isolated populations like the ones on Flores that endured in near total solitude for the better part of 1,000,000 years, adapting, shrinking, surviving in a sealed world the rest of humanity could not reach, and they in turn could not leave. We may never fully know whether those crossings were accident or early intention, whether Crete's ancient hand axes belonged to a species deliberately testing open water, or simply the fortunate survivors of a violent storm. What we do know is that the water did not have the final word. Slowly, unevenly across a span of time too long for any single human mind to properly hold, that improvisation hardened into knowledge, and knowledge hardened into skill. Someone learned to hollow a log with fire. Someone learned to bind bundles of reed into a hull that could carry real weight across real distance. Someone in the coldest reaches of the world learned to stretch skin over bone and build something light enough to carry, sturdy enough to survive ice. None of this happened as a single triumphant breakthrough. It happened the way almost everything genuinely difficult happens, in small, unglamorous increments passed from a parent's hands to a child's, refined a little further with each passing generation until the accumulated weight of all that patient effort finally tipped the balance. Water that had once meant near certain danger slowly, quietly became something people could actually depend on. And once that dependence was earned, everything changed. The very rivers that had spent hundreds of thousands of years dividing and killing became almost overnight, by the standard of deep time, the foundation upon which entire civilizations chose to build themselves. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, each one cradling a great early society precisely because the fear that had once kept people apart had finally painstakingly been resolved. Officials in ancient Egypt learned to read the river's rise the way we might read a forecast, and used that knowledge to plan an entire nation's harvest. And still, underneath all of that hard-won mastery, the old fear never fully disappeared. It simply changed its clothing, migrating into myth, into the ferryman waiting at the edge of every culture's imagined afterlife, still charging a fare, still deciding in story, if no longer in daily reality, who got to cross and who did not. There is a pattern worth naming clearly here, because it is not really a story about rivers at all, not underneath everything else. It is a story about how a species facing an absolute indifferent barrier eventually finds a way through it, not through any single genius or any single dramatic moment, but through an almost unbearable accumulation of ordinary human effort, most of it unrecorded, most of it undertaken by people whose names we will never know, and whose individual lives left no trace anyone could ever recover. The woman at the riverbank, the father who lost his son to a current colder than he had ever felt, the child who grew up learning without being told directly which parts of the bank to trust and which to fear, the specialist who spent days hollowing a single log, uncertain whether the finished boat would even float. The two villages, a short walk apart along the Sepik, still speaking words the other cannot understand, still finding some way market day after market day to trade anyway. None of them knew they were building anything larger than their own small immediate survival. And yet, added together across an almost incomprehensible span of time, their accumulated effort quietly reshaped where and how our entire species came to live. This is, in the end, the oldest human story there is, repeated in 1,000 different forms across every chapter of everything that has ever happened to us. Something ordinary and indifferent stands between people and what they need. Some of them are lost to it quietly without ceremony, their names never recorded anywhere, remembered only if at all in a burial like the one at Sungkya, where 2 children were sent into the earth wrapped in thousands of hours of careful, grieving ivory work by parents who left behind no explanation of what had taken them, only overwhelming, wordless evidence that they had been loved. Others slowly, generation after generation, learn enough to make the crossing survivable, and in doing so change not only their own fate, but the fate of everyone who comes after them. Civilizations rise on the strength of that hard-won knowledge, and just as reliably they eventually fall, undermined by the very floods or droughts or shifting courses that their nilometers and their careful measurements could never fully predict. Power built on a river's generosity has always been power borrowed rather than owned outright, and every civilization that ever rooted itself along a great river eventually learn this lesson one way or another, whether gently or with considerable violence. What endures more reliably than any single civilization is something quieter and considerably more stubborn. It is the accumulated, carried forward memory of ordinary people who kept crossing anyway, who kept building slightly better boats, who kept teaching their children which bend in the river to trust, who kept finding some narrow, hard-negotiated bridge of trust and trade across even the most impassable linguistic and cultural divide. Empires that once seemed permanent along the banks of the Nile or the Tigris are gone now, their names known mostly to historians. The basic human patience that once hollowed a log with fire, that once studied a hippo's temperament well enough to survive beside it, that once measured a flood carefully enough to feed an entire nation, somehow persisted quietly underneath every rise and fall that followed. It is worth remembering, too, how much of this story was never written down at all, and never could have been. The footprints at White Sand survive because a particular patch of mud happened to dry at exactly the right moment. The trackway at Hapisburh survived for the better part of 1,000,000 years, and then had only a few weeks to be seen before the tide erased it forever. For every trace that happened to survive long enough for us to find it uncountable, others simply vanished, washed downstream, buried too deep, exposed too briefly, or exposed to no one at all. The story this video has told tonight is by necessity built from the rare lucky fragments that happen to last. The far larger story, the one made of every ordinary crossing that left no mark whatsoever, we will never fully know. That absence is not a failure of the evidence. It is in its own way part of the point. Most of history belonged to people who were never recorded doing anything remarkable at all, only surviving quietly one difficult crossing at a time. There is one last piece of evidence worth leaving you with tonight. Small and easy to overlook, and yet somehow more moving than almost anything else in this story. In more than one city built along a great river, modern engineers digging the foundations for a new bridge have discovered something waiting for them in the mud. Below the remains of a much older crossing point, a worn ford, sometimes a fragment of an even earlier wooden bridge, sitting almost exactly where the new structure was already planned to go. In London, for instance, the modern bridges spanning the Thames sit close to a crossing point used in one form or another, since long before the city itself existed, a place where the river simply happened to run shallow enough, calm enough to be trusted, and where people without any planning committee or any recorded decision simply kept choosing to cross generation after generation until the crossing itself became the reason a city grew there at all. Nobody living today chose that exact spot. It was chosen for us quietly by countless ordinary people who will never be named, each one making the same small practical calculation. The woman at the very beginning of this story once made standing at the edge of moving water wondering if the far side was worth the risk. The engineers who find these older crossings buried beneath their own foundations rarely describe the discovery as an inconvenience, even when it slows their work considerably. Several have spoken instead about a particular kind of quiet recognition that comes with realizing exactly where they are standing, that the modern steel and concrete taking shape above their heads is not choosing a new path through the landscape at all, but simply continuing in a considerably more permanent form, a decision made by people whose names, whose faces, whose entire language have been lost to time, but whose basic judgment about where a river could safely be trusted turned out to be good enough to still be trusted today. There is a kind of continuity in that which no monument or written record could ever quite capture, in the same way a silent inheritance passed down, not through story or memory, but simply through repeated footsteps worn into the same patch of riverbank, for longer than anyone can say with certainty. It usually was, not always, but often enough that we are all, in some sense, still walking across the same invisible paths they first found for us, whether we ever think about it or not. This same basic shape a stubborn danger, a slow accumulation of hard-won knowledge, a fragile mastery that eventually became something almost taken for granted, will likely feel familiar to anyone who has followed this channel through other chapters of the human story. It is the shape of fire once feared and finally tamed. It is the shape of illness once entirely mysterious and gradually imperfectly understood. It is the shape of hunger itself, met across countless generations by patient trial and accumulated agricultural knowledge, one failed harvest and one successful one at a time. Rivers are simply one particular version of a pattern that runs through nearly everything human beings have ever managed to survive, a pattern built less on individual brilliance than on the sheer quiet persistence of people willing to keep trying, generation after generation, long after any single one of them could have known whether the effort would eventually pay off. That persistence rarely announces itself. It does not usually look like courage in the way we tend to picture courage, dramatic, sudden, witnessed by others. It looks more often like a father teaching his child exactly where the current runs fastest. It looks like a specialist quietly hollowing a log for the fourth time after the first 3 attempts split and sank. It looks like a farmer standing beside a familiar river every planting season, trusting a pattern his own parents trusted before him, even after a bad year had every reason to make him doubt it. This is not the kind of history that tends to get remembered by name. It is nonetheless the kind of history that actually built the world each of us was eventually born into. Perhaps that is the truest thread running underneath everything explored tonight. Every civilization we named will eventually be reduced to ruins. Someone else digs carefully out of the ground, its temples fallen, its language forgotten, its gods no longer prayed to by anyone living. And yet the quieter knowledge, the kind that lives not in monuments but in ordinary hands, in a parent's caution, in a community's accumulated memory of which, crossing to trust, has a way of outlasting even the grandest empire built upon it. Empires are loud while they last and silent once they fall. The patience that first taught a person to cross safely has never once fully gone silent, carried forward quietly in every generation that came after, whether they ever knew where it had originally come from or not. Rivers still flow the way they always have. The river does not remember any of this. That has always been the strange, quiet truth, sitting underneath everything we have discussed tonight. Water has no memory. It simply moves. It moved this way before the first woman ever stood at its edge, wondering whether to cross. It will move this way long after every civilization we have named tonight has been forgotten by everyone but a handful of historians. It does not know it once divided a people into 2 separate languages. It does not know it once took a child from his father's hand in 10 seconds of cold current. It does not know that someone somewhere once knelt beside it for days, burning and scraping a single log till it finally floated the way they needed it. It never asked to be crossed. It never asked to be feared or measured or worshipped or trusted. It simply continued doing what water has always done, moving downhill toward the sea, indifferent to every meaning a passing species chose to place upon it. We are the ones who remember. We carry it forward in language we no longer notice using. In the quiet way a parent's hand tightens near deep water for reasons neither of them could fully explain if asked. In a coin once placed in a hand before burial, in a story about a ferryman waiting at the edge of the next world in a bridge built without anyone quite deciding to on the exact spot where people have always chosen to cross. We carry it too in something harder to name, a kind of trust-worn smooth over thousands of generations that a danger faced honestly enough for long enough by enough ordinary people eventually becomes something survivable. It was true of rivers. It has been true of nearly everything else this species has ever had to learn to live beside. Somewhere tonight, water moves past a riverbank exactly the way it moved past that same stretch of ground 10,000 years ago. Unhurried, indifferent to everything it has ever taken and everything it has ever allowed. A bridge crosses it now, quiet, unremarkable, lit softly from below. A person walks across it without looking down. They do not think about the ones who came before them. They do not need to. That is what it means in the end for a crossing to finally be safe. Further along, the same water moves past a bend it has always moved past. Patient, unhurried, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. Somewhere upstream, a single leaf lets go of its branch and settles onto the surface. The current takes it gently the way it has always taken everything offered to it. It turns once. It drifts towards the dark water ahead, and the night settles quietly over the river the way it always has.